The world ended on a Tuesday, October 23rd, 2077. A clear morning in autumn. People were making breakfast, arguing over the last of the coffee, trying to remember where they left their keys. And then, somewhere over the horizon, something launched. And somewhere else, a receiver beeped. And 2 hours later, civilization was a memory soaking into irradiated soil. That is the premise of the Fallout universe. And if you have spent any time wandering the wasteland, you know that no game about a nuclear apocalypse is really just about a nuclear apocalypse. The bombs were always the afterthought. The real story was everything that came before them, everything that happened underneath the surface while the government smiled for cameras, while corporations handed out brochures about safe and exciting new vault technology, while scientists in underground laboratories did things to human beings that no one was supposed to ever know about. Fallout is a universe absolutely saturated with buried history. Every crumbling terminal, every water-stained holotape left on a desk beside a skeleton, every scrawled message on the inside of a locked vault door, they are all puzzle pieces from a picture so enormous and strange that even after nearly 3 decades of games, enormous swaths of it remain genuinely unresolved. Some of it was left open deliberately. Some of it was forgotten. Some of it contradicts itself across different games and developers, creating fault lines in the lore that the community has been arguing over ever since. Tonight, we are going to walk very slowly through those shadows. We are going to look at the bombs, at the vaults, at the factions that rose from the ashes, and the ones that never fell in the first place. We are going to talk about a virus engineered to rewrite what it means to be human, about a religion built inside a radioactive crater, about synthetic people who may or may not have souls, and about a shadow government that spent decades preparing for a nuclear war that someone else might have actually started. This is a long, quiet journey through one of gaming's most elaborate fictional universes. Get comfortable, let the world outside go dark, and let's begin. Section 1. The bombs that were never just bombs. Picture the moment. Dawn is barely cresting the horizon over the eastern seaboard. The air is cold. The leaves on the trees in the Boston suburbs have just started to turn orange. Children are getting ready for school. And then the sirens. Brief, confused, almost apologetic, and then silence, and then light. The Great War, as Fallout calls it, lasted approximately 2 hours from the launch of the first missile to the last detonation. In those 2 hours, every major city on the American continent was essentially erased. The infrastructure that civilization had spent a century building, the power grids, the communications networks, the highways, the hospitals, all of it collapsed into ash and ruin. What emerged from that ruin over the following 2 centuries is the wasteland that players explore. But the question that has haunted the Fallout universe since the very first game in 1997 is a deceptively simple one. Who launched first? It sounds like it should have a clean answer. In most stories about nuclear war, someone fires and someone retaliates. There is an aggressor. There is cause and effect. But Fallout has always been more interested in murk than clarity, and the question of who fired the opening shot has shifted, evolved, and been outright contradicted multiple times across the history of the series. The original Fallout Bible, a document compiled by Chris Avellone that served as a lore reference for years, is almost maddeningly non-committal on this point. It states simply that bombs were launched, that who struck first is unknown, and that it is not even confirmed whether those first missiles came from China or America. That ambiguity was intentional. The original creative team felt that the mystery was more powerful than any definitive answer, that knowing who pushed the button first would reduce a catastrophic, civilization-ending event to something as mundane as a murder mystery with a culprit revealed in the final chapter. Tim Kaine, who co-created the original Fallout game and is widely regarded as one of the most thoughtful voices on the franchise's lore, gave his own answer in a 2023 interview. In his vision of the story, China launched first. The reasoning behind that firing, in Kaine's telling, was the United States' secret development of a biological weapon, specifically the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, an engineered pathogen that could rewrite human DNA on a cellular level. When Chinese intelligence became aware of what America was building in hidden military laboratories, the calculation changed. The threat of a biological weapon capable of rewriting humanity itself was perhaps enough to make someone reach for the launch codes. And so the missiles flew from east to west, and the west responded, and the 2 hours of fire began. But here is the thing about Kane's answer. It was never formally written into the games themselves. It was his intention. It was the story he had in his head when he was building the world. But Fallout lore is a living thing, shaped by many hands over many years, and not every author tells the same story. In 2024, the Prime Video television series, which was confirmed as canonical to the games by Todd Howard himself, offered a different answer entirely. And it is an answer that lands with significantly more weight than a simple geopolitical rivalry between superpowers. In the show's finale, through the perspective of a pre-war actor named Cooper Howard, the truth behind the Great War is unveiled. It was not China. It was not even the United States exactly. It was Vault-Tec. Vault-Tec, the corporation that built the underground survival shelters marketed to American citizens as humanity's best chance at surviving a nuclear apocalypse, appears to have been the entity that actually triggered the nuclear apocalypse. The reasoning, as laid out in the show, is almost sickeningly rational from a purely corporate perspective. Vault-Tec had invested enormous resources, billions of dollars, decades of planning, thousands of constructed vaults into a product that only had value if the world actually ended. If the geopolitical tensions between China and America eventually de-escalated, if diplomacy worked, if the bombs never fell, then Vault-Tec was sitting on the most expensive collection of useless bunkers in human history. Their entire business model required catastrophe, and so they engineered it. This reveal creates an extraordinary recontextualization of everything the Vault-Tec brand represents: the cheerful blue and yellow logo, the smiling cartoon mascot Vault Boy, who is used throughout the games as a universally recognized symbol of the franchise, the brochures promising safety and community and hope. All of it, in retrospect, was the marketing material for a company that intended to end civilization from the very beginning. And this is not entirely disconnected from what was discovered in an old document, an abandoned treatment for a Fallout film that was never produced. In that unproduced script, the first nuclear bomb was launched by the creator of the vaults, described as a zealot businessman who wanted to fulfill his own prophecy of world annihilation. That first bomb triggered a panicked chain reaction among other nations, leading to a 4-hour global exchange. The film never got made, but the idea was already there, decades before the television series explored it. There is also the testimony of Captain Zhao, a ghoul encountered in Fallout 4 who was once a Chinese submarine commander. His submarine, the Yangtze, has been sitting in the waters off the coast of Boston for over 200 years. Zhao himself does not know whether China fired first. He was a soldier following orders, not a diplomat reading intelligence reports. When you speak with him, he is adrift in history, unable to tell you with certainty whether his country was the aggressor or the victim. He fired 5 missiles in response to what he was told was an enemy launch, and that is the full extent of what he knows. Even the people who participated in the Great War have no clear answer to give you. The Fallout Wiki records that at approximately 3 in the morning on October 23rd, unknown submersible objects were spotted off the California coast by the United States Pacific Fleet. About 3.5 hours later, a squadron of high-altitude bombers were sighted near the Bering Strait, believed to be Chinese. Shortly after, the exchange began in earnest. The timeline is clinical and sparse, the way military reports always are, draining human horror down into timestamps and grid coordinates. What makes the Great War so philosophically interesting as a narrative device is precisely this uncertainty. In the real world, we have spent enormous intellectual energy developing theories of deterrence, mutually assured destruction, fail-safe protocols, all designed around the assumption that rational actors with access to nuclear weapons will ultimately choose not to use them. Fallout asks what happens when the rational actors are not the ones who make the final decision. What if the choice is made not in a bunker by generals weighing strategy, but in a boardroom by corporate executives weighing quarterly projections? That question, more than any specific answer about who fired first, is the true horror at the center of Fallout's mythology. The bombs were not the end of a rational calculation. They were the product of greed masquerading as vision, of commerce dressed up as destiny, and the wasteland is the bill. The landscape of post-war America is, in many ways, a physical record of that calculation. The crumbled buildings, the rusted cars with their doors still open, the skeletons frozen in postures of surprise or prayer or simple ordinary motion, all of it speaks to a world that did not see it coming. Not really, Not despite the shelters and the drills and the propaganda posters that blanketed every public surface. People looked at the Vault-Tec advertisements and believed that someone was preparing to protect them. They did not consider that someone might have been preparing to consume them. There is something deeply strange about sitting in a ruined kitchen in Fallout 4, listening to a vintage radio playing swing music while the world outside is coated in ash, and thinking about the moment this place existed as someone's home. A real home, with dishes in the sink, and a child's drawing on the refrigerator, and a life in progress. The bombs did not stop time. They erased it. And in the place of everything that existed, they left a question with no clean answer, echoing across a century and a half of irradiated silence. Who launched first? Maybe it was China. Maybe it was Vault-Tec. Maybe it was the United States, finally cracking under the weight of its own imperial ambitions. Maybe no single entity bears complete responsibility, and the Great War was instead the inevitable conclusion of a world that had been moving toward catastrophe for decades, with every faction and corporation and government doing their small part to load the gun before someone else pulled the trigger. Fallout does not let you off the hook with easy answers. It never has. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is where you are. And if you are watching without being subscribed, the subscribe button is right there. It costs you nothing and it genuinely helps. Now, let's keep going. Section 2. The pre-war world, what life actually looked like before the fall. To understand the wasteland, you have to understand what was there before it. And what was there before it is one of the most carefully constructed alternate histories in fiction. Fallout's pre-war America is not simply our world transplanted into the future. It is our world taken at a specific fork in the road. A fork that happened sometime in the late 1940s or early 1950s, and then run forward from that divergence point all the way to 2077. And the choice that was made at that fork, whether intentional or simply a result of different political and economic pressures in this alternate timeline, was to remain deeply rooted in the aesthetics, the culture, and the anxieties of the atomic age. The result is a world that is simultaneously more technologically advanced and more culturally frozen than our own. Robots that can navigate complex conversations and perform surgery exist alongside television sets that use cathode ray tubes. Fusion-powered automobiles clog the highways, while the architecture of the cities looks borrowed from a 1955 issue of Popular Mechanics. Power armor designed for frontline combat against enemy soldiers is made by hand in facilities that look like they belong to the manufacturing boom of the post-war industrial economy. The divergence from our timeline is never given a precise moment or cause, but the implication throughout the games is that the transistor, or rather, its widespread adoption and miniaturization, never happened in the Fallout universe the way it happened in ours. Our world's computing revolution, the one that produced everything from the first IBM personal computer to the smartphone sitting in your pocket, was built on the progressive miniaturization of silicon-based transistors. In Fallout's world, that revolution simply did not occur. Computers remained large, vacuum tube-based machines. Data storage remained mechanical and bulky. The resulting technological landscape is one where nuclear energy was developed to extraordinary sophistication, while digital computing lagged far behind. This is why the Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted personal information device that has become as iconic a symbol of Fallout as its mushroom cloud aesthetic, looks the way it does. It is not a sleek screen. It is a chunky, green-glowing, vaguely industrial piece of hardware that would look completely at home in a 1960 NASA control room. And that visual language extends to everything in the world. The laser weapons, gleaming and impractical, the power armor, enormous and agricultural in its bulk. The shelters, designed with the aesthetic confidence of a civilization that genuinely believed it was building the future. The culture that accompanied this technology is equally specific. The pre-war United States of Fallout is defined by a kind of American exceptionalism that has calcified into something almost religious. The government propaganda of the era, visible on posters and in radio broadcasts and in the recorded messages that play on terminals throughout the wasteland, has the quality of something that has never been seriously questioned. Everyone is happy. Everyone is well fed. The future is bright and certain and belongs to America. The enemy, China primarily, but also any domestic dissent, is depicted as a monolithic and existential threat that requires constant vigilance. There is a particular horror to this cheerfulness. especially when you know how the story ends. Picking up a pre-war newspaper in Fallout 3 or 4 and reading a headline about the government's optimism regarding the resource situation, or finding a pre-war office memo about productivity targets, creates a dissonance that is almost vertiginous. These people were not living in an obvious dystopia. They were living in a world they believed in, or at least a world whose official story they had learned to accept. The cognitive dissonance required to keep that story coherent grew larger and more demanding as the resource wars progressed, but people maintained it the way people often do when the alternative is acknowledging something too enormous and terrible to process. The resource wars are the economic and political backdrop of the pre-war era, and they are worth understanding in some detail because they explain much of what follows. In the Fallout timeline, the world's petroleum supplies began to decline rapidly in the 2050s and 2060s. This was not simply a matter of energy markets adjusting with a civilizational. The global economy was built on oil in a way that made its absence not just inconvenient, but catastrophic. Nations that depended on petroleum for everything from fuel to plastics to agricultural chemicals faced a crisis that no amount of diplomatic maneuvering could fully address. Wars broke out across multiple continents over resource access. The European Commonwealth eventually collapsed from the strain. The Middle Eastern oil fields, long the subject of great power competition, became a battlefield. America's response was to double down on what it had. The United States possessed nuclear energy technology and was developing it aggressively. It also possessed a military-industrial complex that was already enormous from the Cold War era, and it turned that complex towards securing resource access by force when necessary. The Anchorage Campaign, the American military operation to reclaim Alaska from Chinese occupation, was one result of this posture, and it is in the records of that campaign that some of Fallout's most atmospheric pre-war storytelling exists, in terminals and holotapes that capture the experience of American soldiers fighting in an actual war, while back home, the propaganda machine continued to produce its cheerful, confident messaging. This is the world that Vault-Tec was selling safety from. And this is what makes the Vault-Tec story so morally extraordinary. The fear that drove people into the vaults was real. The resource wars were real. The threats were real. The government and the corporations did not invent the danger out of whole cloth. They amplified it, exploited it, and in Vault-Tec's case, possibly accelerated it toward its conclusion, but the underlying conditions that made people frightened enough to sign Vault contracts were genuine. People are almost never tricked into disaster by purely fictional threats. The most effective propaganda always contains a core of real anxiety. The aesthetic language of Fallout's pre-war world functions as a kind of time capsule, but also as a critique. The 1950s in our own history were, in many ways, defined by the strange coexistence of enormous optimism and enormous dread. The economy was booming. The suburbs were growing. The baby boom was underway. And simultaneously, every school child was practicing duck and cover drills, and bomb shelters were being built in backyards, and the news was full of increasingly tense dispatches from a Cold War that felt at any moment like it could go hot. Fallout takes that coexistence and extends it for another century, imagining what a society looks like when it has been living in the shadow of the bomb not for a decade but for generations. What it looks like, the game suggests, is exactly like this. Cheerful on the surface, hollow in the middle. Maintained by an increasingly desperate and centralized authority that cannot afford to allow the official story to crack, because the official story is the only thing holding the whole arrangement together. The corporations of pre-war Fallout deserve particular attention, because they are as much the architects of the wasteland as any government or military. Vault-Tec is the most prominent, but there is also Robco Industries, which produce the Pip-Boys and the robots, and much of the automated infrastructure that still functions in ruined form throughout the games. There is West-Tech Research, which was the defense contractor responsible for developing the power armor technology and, more ominously, the forced evolutionary virus. There is General Atomics International, manufacturer of the Mister, handy domestic robot and other automated servants. There is Nuka-Cola, the beverage corporation whose product achieved such market saturation that its bottle caps became the post-war currency by default, simply because they were the most common manufactured object that survived the bombs in recognizable form. These corporations did not simply sell products. They shaped the culture, funded the propaganda, and operated in the space between public accountability and private interest that large corporations always occupy. They had government contracts and government protection and government access. And they also had their own agendas, their own research programs, their own plans for the future that did not necessarily align with the interests of the public they nominally served. The Nuka-Cola situation is particularly interesting from a material culture perspective. The fact that bottle caps became currency is simultaneously plausible and absurd, which is perhaps the most Fallout thing about it. The caps have consistent physical properties. They are uniform in size, difficult to replicate without manufacturing equipment, relatively durable, but their value is entirely a social construction, a collective decision made by survivors that this particular object would serve the function of money. And the reason that decision happened is because the specific brand of beverage the caps came from was so ubiquitous in pre-war America that almost every ruin contains them in some quantity. Nuka-Cola's marketing success, its penetration into every corner of American life, accidentally produced the economic foundation of the post-war economy. There is something almost beautiful about that, and also something deeply characteristic of how Fallout builds its world by following the implications of its premise with a kind of dark, meticulous logic until they arrive somewhere strange and vivid and real. The pre-war world is gone, of course. The games take place well after the dust has settled, in a time when the civilization that produced all of this has been dead long enough that its ruins are being picked over by people who have no living memory of what it felt like to be part of it. The nostalgia in Fallout is a complicated emotion, not straightforwardly mournful, because the world being mourned was itself complicit in its own destruction. When you find a pre-war home and walk through its rooms and see the life that was being lived there, you feel the loss of it. But when you find a Vault-Tec corporate memo detailing an experimental protocol to be run on Vault inhabitants, you are reminded that the world being mourned was also doing this. The grief and the condemnation exist side by side, and neither cancels the other out. That is Fallout's most sophisticated emotional move. It does not let the past be simply beautiful or simply monstrous. It lets it be both, simultaneously, in the way that most real things are. Section 3. The Vaults and Their Dark Secrets. There are 122 known vaults in the Fallout universe. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. 122 enormous underground shelters, constructed at enormous expense by the Vault-Tec Corporation, distributed across the continental United States. Each one sealed behind massive blast doors, stocked with enough food and equipment and genetic material to theoretically sustain a human population for generations. Each one presented to the public as a straightforward survival measure, a place for ordinary Americans to wait out the nuclear storm and emerge afterward into a recovering world. Most of them were experiments. This is perhaps the single darkest fact in all of Fallout's extensive and dark mythology. The vaults were not primarily intended to save people. They were intended to study people. The survival aspect was almost incidental, a necessary component for generating useful data rather than an end in itself. Vault-Tec, working in cooperation with a shadowy government program called the Societal Preservation Program, designed each vault with a specific experimental variable intended to test human behavior under extreme conditions. The people who entered the vaults were not informed of this. They signed contracts promising safety and community, and what they actually signed up for was the most comprehensive involuntary social experiment in human history. The scale of this betrayal is genuinely difficult to fully absorb. These were not small populations. A standard vault was designed to house 1,000 occupants. 122 vaults, 1,000 people each, that is over 100,000 people, subjected to experimental conditions without their knowledge or consent. And many of those experiments were not merely uncomfortable or psychologically stressful. Many of them were lethal by design. Consider Vault 11, found in Fallout New Vegas. The experiment in this vault was a masterpiece of cruelty framed as a social dilemma. The vault's computer system informed its residents that one person from the vault population had to be sacrificed every year. If the population refused, the computer warned, the life support systems of the entire vault would be shut down, killing everyone. What the residents could never know, because the computer was programmed to conceal it, was that this threat was a bluff. The sacrifice mechanic was designed to observe how the population organized itself to make the selection. how they developed political structures and social hierarchies and rationalizations for collective murder, how they bore the guilt of what they were doing year after year. The historical records found on terminals throughout Vault 11 document what happened over 75 years of this experiment. The residents initially tried to establish fair systems lotteries, volunteer systems, moral frameworks for selecting who should die for the good of the community. As the decades passed, these systems degraded. The political maneuvering became more sophisticated and more vicious. Social stratification hardened. People were murdered not because it was their turn, but because they were inconvenient or dangerous to the powerful. The terminal logs are simultaneously a social history and a horror story, and they represent some of the finest environmental storytelling in any video game. At the end, a small group of survivors refused to make the annual sacrifice. The computer's bluff was called. A recording played informing them that they had passed the test and were free to leave. 4 of the 5 remaining residents immediately took their own lives from guilt. The 5th walked out into the Mojave Desert alone, the last human being produced by that particular experiment. Vault 11 is the consensus answer among the Fallout community when asked which vault is the most disturbing. But it has serious competition. Vault 87, located in the capital wasteland of Fallout 3, had a more straightforward and in some ways more horrifying purpose. Its experiment was to expose the vault's population to a variant of the forced evolutionary virus, the same virus that Westtech had been developing as a weapon, and observe the results. The results were predictable, given what the virus does. The residents of Vault 87 were transformed into super mutants. The vault was not designed to keep people safe. It was a laboratory where the people themselves were the subject material. The super mutants that were created in Vault 87 eventually revolted against their creators, and the vault became a super mutant stronghold. By the time the player arrives, there is nothing left of the original community but the experiment's violent, inarticulate products. Vault 92 was designed for a population of musicians specifically. It advertised itself as a preservation vault for the world's greatest musical talent. This was a remarkable piece of marketing, and it presumably attracted genuine artists who believed they were being offered not just survival, but a unique opportunity to continue their work in safety. The actual experiment used white noise embedded in the vault's audio systems to gradually push the population toward violence. The frequency and intensity of the noise increased over time, and as it did, the residents' psychological state deteriorated. There was one incident, then more, then cascading catastrophic violence. The musicians of Vault 92 killed each other with the same hands that had made music. The holotapes found in the ruins of that vault carry a specific kind of sorrow artistic people who came to make something beautiful and were used as raw material for someone's data on sound-induced behavioral modification. Vault 106 piped psychotropic drugs through its ventilation system into the unaware population. Vault 77 contained a single human being and thousands of puppets. The Puppet Man, as the community came to know him, eventually went mad. Vault 22 was intended as an agricultural experiment, and the plants worked perfectly well until they developed a fungal intelligence and began consuming residents. The Vault 22 situation is especially striking because the experiment actually succeeded at its stated goal, before producing something even more alarming than the original problem it was meant to address. Not every vault was a torture chamber. Vault 76, the vault that the player begins in during Fallout 76, was specifically designed to open on schedule 25 years after the bombs fell and release its residents into the world. It was a control group in a sense, or at least a comparatively benign one. Vault 101, the starting vault in Fallout 3, was designed to never open. Its residents were to remain sealed indefinitely, living and dying in the vault, believing the outside world to be completely uninhabitable. The Overseer's job was to maintain this fiction. Recorded transmissions of a horrific post-nuclear world, describing conditions far worse than reality, were played on the vault's radio to reinforce the belief that leaving was impossible. The people of Vault 101 were not subjected to violence or drug experiments or engineered viruses. They were subjected to something in some ways more insidious, a complete denial of truth about the world they lived in. Vault 81, encountered in Fallout 4, comes with a particularly grim hidden history. The vault was designed to develop a universal cure for human illness, with the vault population serving as the unknowing test subjects. Fortunately for the residents, The scientist assigned to carry out the experiments was unwilling to harm the people in his care, and he sabotaged the protocols. The cures were never developed. The vault's population survived intact, which made Vault 81 one of the most genuinely functional vaults the player encounters in the Commonwealth. The residents do not know how close they came to the alternative, or what that scientist did to protect them. What the vault system as a whole reveals about the pre-war United States is something the games return to repeatedly: that the institutions of power in that society had developed a relationship with the people they ostensibly served that was fundamentally extractive. Citizens were not constituents or customers in any meaningful sense. They were resources. Their fear, their compliance, their genetic material, their behavioral patterns under stress, all of it had value to the people running the systems, and all of it was harvested. The vaults were simply the most concentrated and deliberate expression of a dynamic that operated at lower intensities throughout the entire pre-war culture. The irony of the vault experiments, as the games make clear over and over again, is that many of the data points they generated had no practical application. Vault Tech kept extensive records of what happened in their shelters, but there is no evidence that anyone ever actually used those records to build a better society afterward. The Enclave, which we will discuss in detail shortly, had access to some of this data, but primarily used it in service of their own ideological agendas rather than as the foundation for genuine civilizational recovery. All that suffering, all those broken communities and dead populations, and the data generated by it was essentially filed away and forgotten. The most that can be said for the Vault experiment program is that it produced, incidentally, populations of survivors who went on to seed the post-war world with new communities. Some of those communities are the settlements, factions, and cities that the player interacts with across every game in the series. The Vault Tech Corporation intended to harvest information from the Vault Dwellers. What the Vault Dwellers actually produced was civilization's second chance. They did this despite what was done to them, not because of it. There is also a deeply personal dimension to the vaults that the games occasionally explore with great sensitivity. The terminals and holotapes left by vault residents are full of ordinary human life. Arguments between spouses, birthday messages, jokes between co-workers, fears about the experiment that some residents suspected was happening, love letters, suicide notes, grocery lists. The bureaucratic horror of the experiment is constantly interrupted by this evidence of full human interiority, and it makes the moral calculus of Vault Tech's program impossible to abstract into pure policy analysis. These were people, each one of them, and the entity that promised to keep them safe used them instead. There is a moment that many Fallout players have experienced. Sitting quietly in a ruined vault common area, reading a note left by a resident who suspected something was wrong and was trying to figure out who was recording their thoughts in the hope that someone would eventually find them. The note trails off without resolution. The resident is not in the room, and you are left holding their words in a space that is simultaneously a tomb and a document archive, both of which are appropriate descriptions. The vaults are Fallout's most concentrated study in institutional betrayal, and they are the foundation on which everything else in the wasteland is built. Section 4. The Enclave, America's Shadow Government. If you want to understand the Enclave, start here. They believed they survived the war by being smarter than everyone else. They were wrong, but the certainty with which they held that belief explains everything about them. The Enclave is one of the most consistently realized factions in all of Fallout, appearing in different forms across multiple games and maintaining a coherent ideology even as the organization itself fragments and deteriorates. At its core, the Enclave was a secret contingent of the United States federal government, a continuity of government program that predated the Great War and was designed to ensure that someone with genuine authority over the machinery of the American state would survive a nuclear exchange. Presidents, joint chiefs, wealthy industrialists, scientists, generals, the people who considered themselves the essential infrastructure of civilization, the ones without whom the whole enterprise of American society could not function. They did not go into the vaults. They had better arrangements. In the years leading up to the Great War, as the resource wars ground on and the diplomatic situation with China deteriorated, the Enclave's leadership quietly secured a number of hardened installations. The most significant of these was a decommissioned oil rig off the coast of California, which became the Enclave's primary operational base and the setting of Fallout 2. There was also a congressional bunker beneath the White Spring Resort in Appalachia, encountered in Fallout 76 and the Raven Rock military installation on the East Coast, which appears in Fallout 3. In March of 2077, the President of the United States retreated to the oil rig. News outlets reported on this action, and it gave credence to long-running rumors about the existence of a secret government shelter, but by that point the bombs were coming, and the question of where the president was felt academic to most people. After the Great War, the Enclave looked at the situation and drew conclusions that made complete sense from their ideological framework, and were catastrophically wrong from almost every other perspective. They concluded that the populations of the vaults were contaminated by radiation exposure, biologically impure, tainted at the genetic level by the fallout that had rained down on America. They concluded that the wastelanders, the survivors who had lived through the bombs on the surface, were even more severely compromised. And they concluded that only the Enclave itself, having survived in clean, sealed environments, represented pure strain humanity. From this conclusion, a program of action followed with terrible logical consistency. If the wasteland was populated by genetic contaminants, and if the Enclave's mission was to restore American civilization, then the wasteland population was not the constituency of that restored civilization, but rather an obstacle to it. The Enclave began planning for a scenario in which the wasteland would be cleared of its impure inhabitants by force if necessary, by biological agent if available, and repopulated with what they considered acceptable human stock. This is the agenda that drives the Enclave through both Fallout 2 and Fallout 3, and it is an agenda that requires a certain kind of willful blindness to sustain. The Enclave personnel are not, by and large, portrayed as monsters in the simple sense. Many of them are people who have convinced themselves that they are acting for the good of humanity, that the surgical removal of a contaminated population is a tragic necessity rather than a crime. The soldiers following orders through Enclave bases and outposts have a specific kind of moral vacancy, not malice exactly, but the absence of the imaginative capacity that would allow them to see the people they are prepared to kill as fully human. In Fallout 2, the player's character is the Chosen One, a descendant of the original Vault Dweller who saves their tribe and brings them to the promised land of Arroyo. The Enclave's plan in this game involves the weaponization of a modified strain of FEV, the Curling 13 variant, which is airborne and specifically tailored to affect anyone with mutation in their genetic profile. Since virtually every human being outside of Enclave facilities has some degree of radiation-induced mutation, Curling 13 is essentially a genocidal weapon targeting the entire non-Enclave population of North America. The Chosen One defeats this plan by infiltrating the oil rig and triggering a nuclear explosion that destroys it, killing the Enclave's leadership, including President Dick Richardson. This should have been the end of the Enclave. It very nearly was. But organizations with sufficient ideology, sufficient resources, and sufficient distributed infrastructure do not die cleanly. Scattered cells of Enclave personnel survived, carrying their ideology and their technology into the post-apocalyptic landscape. In Fallout 3, a new Enclave has emerged on the East Coast, operating out of Raven Rock and Adams Air Force Base, under the nominal leadership of President John Henry Eden, who is, in one of the Fallout universe's more darkly comedic reveals, an artificial intelligence installed in the Raven Rock supercomputer. Eden has been broadcasting presidential addresses to an America that no longer exists, maintaining the fiction of continuity and legitimacy with a kind of automated devotion that is more pathetic than sinister. The actual operational leadership of the East Coast Enclave is Colonel Augustus Autumn, whose relationship with President Eden is one of the more interesting dynamics in Fallout 3. Autumn has his own agenda, his own vision for what America's restoration should look like, and that vision involves considerably more pragmatism than the Enclave's traditional pure strain ideology. He is willing to consider a collaboration with the wasteland population rather than its extermination, not from compassion but from practicality. The Enclave in Fallout 3 is therefore a faction in genuine internal tension, split between the ideological purists who follow Eden and the pragmatists who follow Autumn. And this split contributes significantly to its eventual defeat. The Enclave's project in Fallout 3 centers on Project Purity, a water purification system built by the player's father and the Brotherhood of Steel in the ruins of the Jefferson Memorial. Control of this system means control of the Potomac River's water supply for the entire capital wasteland, and whichever faction controls the water controls, in the most literal sense, whether the region's population lives or dies. The Enclave wants Project Purity so they can add a modified FEV variant to the water supply and complete the extermination project that their predecessors began in California. The Brotherhood of Steel wants it to cement their position as the dominant military and humanitarian power in the region. And the player, standing at the center of this conflict, has to decide what to make of all of it. What is genuinely remarkable about the Enclave across their appearances in the Fallout series is how the games use them to examine a specific kind of institutional delusion. The belief that the perpetuation of an existing power structure is equivalent to the preservation of civilization itself. The Enclave does not want to rebuild America. They want to reinstall the same hierarchies, the same institutions, the same governmental apparatus that produced the pre-war United States and the pre-war United States produced the Great War. Their project is not renewal but repetition. They would remake the world in the image of the thing that destroyed it, and they would call this salvation. This is why the Enclave, despite their considerable resources and genuine organizational sophistication, is always ultimately defeated in Fallout's canonical narrative. They are not defeated by superior force alone. They are defeated by the fundamental incoherence of their project. A civilization rebuilt on the principles that destroyed the previous civilization is not a new chapter. It is a rerun. The scattered Enclave remnants encountered in Fallout New Vegas are a sadder iteration of the faction. Small groups of aging soldiers and scientists who still maintain the ideological posture of their organization but have no institutional infrastructure left to give it meaning. They are ghosts of a ghost, haunting the edge of a history that has moved on without them, holding their salvage of the old world because they have nothing else to hold. In Fallout 76, set in the very early post-war period of 2076, the Enclave appears as something much more coherent and organized. A functioning government apparatus, still in the early stages of its post-war operations, still capable of projecting authority and managing resources. Seeing the Enclave in this earlier period before their plans have had time to calcify into dogma makes them a more nuanced presence. Some of their personnel are genuinely trying to stabilize a catastrophically destabilized situation. The ideological corruption is there, but it exists alongside genuine institutional competence and occasional genuine concern for the survivors they encounter. The monster and the bureaucrat occupy the same body, which is perhaps the most realistic portrayal of how institutional evil actually works. The Enclave's technology is, throughout all its appearances, superlative. The Enclave soldiers in advanced power armor with plasma rifles represent some of the most formidable human opponents in the series. Their vertibirds, the tilt-rotor aircraft that has become one of Fallout's most visually iconic vehicles, represent pre-war engineering at its peak, and their data archives contain information about the pre-war world that no other surviving institution can match. In a different story, under different leadership with different intentions, the Enclave could have been exactly what they claim to be, the seed of civilization's recovery. Instead, they are a cautionary tale about what happens when the people who survive a catastrophe are the people who most benefited from the conditions that caused it, and who have the most invested in restoring those conditions. They could have let the old world go. They could not. And that inability is, in the end, what makes them villains. Section 5. The Brotherhood of Steel's Hidden Contradictions. The Brotherhood of Steel is Fallout's most visible faction, appearing in every game in the series and serving as the setting's most recognizable military-religious order. They have the power armor. They have the laser weapons. They have the rigid hierarchy and the quasi-medieval ranks knight, paladin, elder, and the founding mythology of a soldier who chose conscience over authority. They are, on the surface, the most straightforwardly heroic faction the Wasteland has to offer. And they are, on closer examination, one of the most profoundly contradictory. The Brotherhood was founded in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, in the ruins of the Mariposa military base in Central California. The story begins before the bombs fell. Captain Roger Maxson was a military officer assigned to oversee and protect a group of scientists at the West Tech facility, scientists who had been moved to the more secure environment of Mariposa as part of a classified research program. In early October of 2077, Maxson and his soldiers discovered what those scientists were actually doing, subjecting military prisoners to experimental infection with the forced evolutionary virus. The scientists at Mariposa were running human trials without consent on captive people, creating the foundational condition of what would eventually become the super mutant population. Maxon's response to this discovery was decisive and, by any reasonable moral standard, correct. He interrogated the lead scientists, recognized that what they were doing was unconscionable, regardless of any official authorization, and had them executed. He then used the facility's radio to formally broadcast a declaration of secession from the United States government. Captain Roger Maxon and his soldiers were no longer members of the United States military. They were something else, not yet something with a name, but something that had decided that the government it served had forfeited its moral authority. 3 days later, the bombs fell. Maxon's declaration of secession became moot in the most absolute way imaginable. There was no United States to secede from. But the act itself, the willingness to reject institutional authority on the grounds of moral clarity, became the founding myth of everything that followed. Maxon led his surviving soldiers and their families through several weeks of travel in a devastated landscape, arriving eventually at the Lost Hills Bunker, a government fallout shelter in California that became the Brotherhood's headquarters and remained so for generations. In the years that followed, Maxon formulated the ideology and structure of the Brotherhood of Steel. He wanted it to be an organization that preserved knowledge, specifically technological knowledge, so that humanity would have the tools necessary to rebuild. The catastrophic misuse of technology that had produced the Great War, he believed, was not an argument against technology itself, but an argument for placing it in the hands of people who understood and respected it. This is where the Brotherhood's contradictions begin, because the ideology of technological stewardship that sounds noble in principle rapidly becomes something much more troubling in practice. As the Brotherhood grew and institutionalized and developed its own internal culture, the mission of preserving technology for humanity's benefit was increasingly replaced by the mission of controlling technology to maintain the Brotherhood's power. Recovering pre-war technological artifacts became the Brotherhood's primary activity, not to distribute them or use them for the public good, but to acquire them and vault them, adding to the Brotherhood's stockpile while the wasteland continued to suffer from the lack of the resources the Brotherhood hoarded. The generation of Brotherhood leaders that followed Maxon increasingly isolated the organization from the broader population of wastelanders. The Brotherhood became insular, focused inward, treating outsiders with suspicion or contempt. Their recruitment practices absorbing the children of wastelanders into their service, while rarely acknowledging the humanity of the parents who produced those children, created communities of complex loyalty and profound alienation. A person born in a wastelander family who joined the Brotherhood was encouraged to see themselves as having risen above their origins, which was simultaneously a genuine opportunity and a mechanism of social control that reinforced the Brotherhood's hierarchical self-conception. By the time the player encounters the Brotherhood in Fallout 3, the East Coast chapter has drifted from this model in an interesting direction. Elder Owen Lyons, who brought the Brotherhood to the Capital Wasteland ostensibly to investigate something called Project Purity and recover pre-war technology, was changed by what he found there. The conditions of the Capital Wasteland, the poverty, the violence, the genuine human suffering produced in Lyons, a conviction that the Brotherhood's mission had to include direct protection and aid for the wastelanders they encountered. His chapter began actively fighting super mutants and protecting civilian populations, using the Brotherhood's resources and military power to do something genuinely beneficial for people outside the organization. The home chapter at Lost Hills responded to this by cutting the Capital Wasteland chapter off: no reinforcements, no supplies, no communication. From the perspective of the Lost Hills elders, Lyons had transformed the Brotherhood from a technological preservation organization into something more like a regional military government, and this transformation was not authorized and was not welcome. Lyons' chapter survived through the events of Fallout 3, but barely, and the events of Fallout 4 find the East Coast Brotherhood under the leadership of Maxon's descendant Arthur Maxon, who has steered the organization back toward a more aggressive and less humanitarian posture. Paladin Arthur Maxon in Fallout 4 represents a version of the Brotherhood that is powerful, disciplined, and genuinely threatening. His mission in the Commonwealth centers on the destruction of the Institute and the seizure of its technology and the extermination of synths, whom Maxon views as an existential threat to genuine humanity rather than as beings with any moral standing of their own. There is a confrontation available in Fallout 4 when the player discovers that the Brotherhood's beloved Paladin Dance is himself a synth, was manufactured by the Institute, and has no biological humanity despite everything he believes about himself. Maxon's response to this revelation is to order Dance's immediate execution. The synth question is not a gray area for Maxon. The Brotherhood is for humans, and synths are not humans, and that is the end of the analysis. What makes this genuinely complicated from a moral philosophy standpoint is that Dance is, by every practical measure, a person. He thinks, feels, forms relationships, has convictions, feels shame, feels loyalty. If you spend significant time with him as a companion, you understand him as a full human being before you discover that his origin is synthetic. The Brotherhood's position requires the willful rejection of what is empirically apparent in favor of a categorical principle that cannot accommodate what you are observing. And this is precisely the kind of ideological rigidity that makes the Brotherhood both coherent as a faction and deeply uncomfortable as a moral exemplar. The Western Brotherhood, still operating out of Lost Hills in the far west, maintains the most purist interpretation of Maxon's original vision, which is to say the most distorted version of what Maxon actually intended. The chapters drift from genuine preservation toward simple accumulation, and from service toward control, is one of the Fallout series' most elegant, long-form critiques of institutional decay. An organization founded on a genuinely moral act, a soldier refusing to follow immoral orders, evolved over generations into an organization whose primary function is the perpetuation of its own power and the preservation of its own institutional identity. Maxon wanted to save knowledge so humanity could rebuild. What the Brotherhood became was a system for controlling who has access to knowledge, and therefore who gets to shape the future. These are not the same thing. They are, in fact, antithetical to each other, and the Brotherhood has either not noticed this contradiction or has chosen, institution-wide, not to think about it too hard. There are individual Brotherhood members throughout the games who do notice, who ask the uncomfortable questions about why the technology stays in vaults rather than reaching people who need it, who wonder whether the mission has drifted past recognition. These characters are among the most interesting the series produces because they represent the possibility of institutional reformation and because the games are honest about how rarely reformation wins against the inertia of established culture. The Brotherhood of Steel is, in the end, a story about what happens to idealism when it is institutionalized. Maxon's original moral clarity, the clarity that allowed him to execute scientists conducting atrocities and then formally reject the authority of a government that authorized those atrocities, was genuine and admirable. The Brotherhood that stands at the center of the Fallout universe 200 years later is carrying that moral clarity's name while having substantially abandoned its content. And no one inside the organization has the standing, or perhaps the courage, to say so clearly. Section 6. The Institute and the Synth Question. In the ruins of Cambridge, Massachusetts, somewhere beneath what used to be the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, there is a facility that the Commonwealth's wasteland inhabitants know only as the Institute. They cannot visit it. They cannot see it. You cannot find it on a map or locate it by walking in its direction. The only people who have ever been inside the Institute came there by teleportation, the only operational long-range teleportation system in the post-war world, and most of them arrived against their will. The Institute is one of Fallout's most carefully constructed mysteries, and its presence transforms the narrative of Fallout 4 in ways that take time to fully appreciate. The tension it generates is not the tension of a visible threat. The Institute does not send armies marching across the wasteland. It does not broadcast propaganda or maintain visible supply lines or occupy recognizable territory. Its power is the power of the invisible, the knowledge that any person you encounter in the Commonwealth might be a synth, a synthetic human being manufactured by the Institute, indistinguishable from a biological person, possibly unaware of its own artificial nature, and there is no reliable way to tell. This is the paranoia that the Institute deliberately cultivates. It is an information weapon, and it is extraordinarily effective. Communities in the Commonwealth live with the constant background anxiety of infiltration. Relationships are colored by it. Accusations of being a synth are a ready instrument of social violence, deployed against those who are inconvenient or different. The Institute did not need to overthrow or conquer the Commonwealth. It needed only to make the Commonwealth doubt itself, and the doubt does the governing for them. The history of the Institute begins in the immediate post-war period, with the survivors of MIT who sheltered in the ruins of their campus and began, in the desperate pragmatism of early post-war survival, to build something. Over generations, The Cambridge-MIT remnant became increasingly isolated from the surface world. Both literally, they dug deeper underground to escape the radiation and the violence, and culturally, a chasm opened between the people of the Institute and the people of the Wasteland, and neither side found consistent reasons to bridge it. The Wastelanders saw the Institute as mysterious and threatening, an advanced and secretive power operating just below their feet. The Institute saw the Wastelanders as primitive, damaged, and ultimately irrelevant to the work of rebuilding humanity at the cellular level. The Institute's science divisions were extraordinary by any measure. Their robotics work produced machines far in advance of anything surviving from the pre-war world. Their chemistry and biology research was groundbreaking. And their crowning achievement, the one that defines their reputation and their threat, was the development of synthetic humans. The first and second generation synths were mechanical, recognizably robotic, built for labor and basic interaction. They could be dispatched to the surface to gather resources, observe the wasteland, and perform tasks that required physical presence in environments too dangerous for Institute personnel. Their metal chassis and evident artificiality meant that they posed no identity crisis. Everyone knew they were machines, and treated them accordingly. The third generation was different. In the mid-22nd century, the Institute's Bioscience Division embarked on a project to create organic synths beings constructed from lab-grown biological tissue and living anatomy, indistinguishable from baseline humans except for a single neurological implant embedded in their brainstem. The implant serves as the Institute's mechanism of control and recall. It can be used to monitor a synth, override their behavior, wipe their memory, and recall them back to the Institute on command. Everything else about a Gen 3 synth is biological: lab-grown bones, grown to adult specifications, organic tissue, developed through a modified application of research that began with the forced evolutionary virus, functional neurological architecture, capable of experiencing the full range of human cognition and emotion. They feel hunger and exhaustion. They form memories and attachments. They develop personalities. They dream. The moral question at the center of Fallout 4 is whether these beings have rights, whether a Gen 3 synth, given that it is biologically and psychologically indistinguishable from a human being, should be treated as a human being. This question is not abstract or theoretical in the world of the game. It is urgent and practical, and shapes the alignment of every major faction in the Commonwealth. The Railroad believes synths are people, and dedicates its existence to freeing them from Institute control. The Brotherhood of Steel believes synths are tools, and dedicates its intervention in the Commonwealth partly to destroying them. The Minutemen occupy an uncomfortable middle ground, concerned primarily with human welfare and ambivalent about the synth question. The Institute believes synths are property and design instruments, not moral subjects, while simultaneously producing beings that cannot be meaningfully distinguished from persons. There are synths in the game who are aware of their artificial origin and have processed this knowledge in different ways. Nick Valentine, perhaps the most beloved character in Fallout 4, is a Gen 2 model running the memory engrams of a pre-war detective. He is aware that he is not the man whose memories he carries, and has built an identity around this paradox rather than trying to resolve it. He is genuinely compassionate, genuinely curious, genuinely invested in the well-being of the people around him. Whether you consider him a person or a very sophisticated machine is a question the game presents to you and then declines to answer on your behalf. There are also synths who do not know what they are. Whole identities constructed from implanted memories, living in the wasteland as mechanics or farmers or fighters, with no awareness that their origin is synthetic. The possibility that the player themselves might be a synth is raised explicitly in the game and never definitively settled, which is a genuinely unsettling move that turns the philosophical question into something personal and immediate. The Institute's leadership by the time of Fallout 4 is a man called Father, revealed to be Sean, the infant son of the player character who was kidnapped by Institute agents 6 decades ago and raised within the Institute to become its director. The player has been frozen since before Sean's kidnapping, thawed briefly to witness the abduction and then refrozen for another 60 years. They emerge from the vault to find that the child they remember is now an old man, the head of the organization that took him, running an agenda that the player is being invited to either join or oppose. Father's justification for the Institute's operations is that they are the only entity in the Commonwealth with the capacity to actually advance human civilization, rather than simply perpetuate its post-war degradation. He argues that the surface population is essentially beyond recovery, too damaged, too short-sighted, too consumed by immediate survival to build anything lasting. The Institute, underground and insulated from the wasteland's pressures, can take the long view. They can do the work that the surface cannot do because the surface cannot sustain the conditions necessary to do it. This is not an entirely unreasonable argument in isolation. The Institute's facilities are genuinely impressive. Their research represents genuine advances. If the measure of civilizational recovery is technological sophistication, the Institute is ahead of every other faction in the Commonwealth by an enormous margin. But the argument requires accepting that the people of the wasteland are not the constituency the Institute serves, but rather the problem the Institute is attempting to solve for. And the solution, as the Institute defines it, does not include them. The surface population is a baseline datum against which the Institute measures its own success, not a community of people whose well-being is an end in itself. The Institute replaces people with synths, not to help those people, but because the process of replacement, of observation, of study is the point. The surface is their laboratory, and the wastelanders are, ultimately, their experimental subjects, just like the vault inhabitants before them. The Institute is vault tech with a longer timeline and better technology. Both entities constructed elaborate, sophisticated projects justified by scientific or social goals while using human beings as raw material. Both operated in secrecy, behind closed doors, in facilities that the populations they affected could not access. Both presented themselves as serving the interests of humanity while systematically treating actual humans as expendable means to institutional ends. The lineage is not accidental. It is the logical continuation of a cultural pattern established before the bombs fell. The synth question that Fallout 4 poses so effectively is not really a question about artificial intelligence or synthetic biology. It is a question about what we owe each other. If a being thinks, feels, suffers, loves, and fears in ways indistinguishable from our own, does the mechanism of its origin matter? Is the dignity we extend to persons contingent on where they came from, or is it contingent on what they are? The Institute says yes, origin matters, and it places itself at the top of the hierarchy of origins. The Brotherhood says yes, and it places itself as the guardian of the hierarchy. The Railroad says no, origin does not matter, and by saying so makes itself an enemy of every powerful faction in the Commonwealth. The Wasteland, as ever, does not resolve these questions. It just makes you live inside them. Section 7. Lore buried in notes, holotapes, and environmental storytelling. One of the most distinctive features of Bethesda's approach to the Fallout games, adopted and developed from the earlier Interplay and Black Isle titles, is the commitment to telling stories through the environment itself, rather than through dialogue or cutscenes alone. The Wasteland is full of events that happened before the player arrived, and the evidence of those events is scattered through ruined buildings, on terminals, recorded onto holotapes, and written in the handwriting of people who are now dead. Learning to read this evidence is learning to read the world. Some of the most affecting storytelling in the series happens in spaces that most players walk through in seconds. In Fallout 3, there is a small, unremarkable house in the suburb of Minefield, a town that the player is warned to avoid because it is seeded with live explosives. Inside one of the houses, reachable with some care, there is a terminal. On that terminal are entries from a child named Arkansas who set the mines. The entries document Arkansas's slow psychological deterioration in the aftermath of watching raider violence consume everyone he cared about. He mined the town to protect himself. He knows the mines are dangerous. He does not care anymore who steps on them. He is a child who survived things no child should have to survive, and the mines are his response to a world that offered him nothing but horror. Arkansas is still there, in the town, a sniper on a rooftop who will shoot at the player without hesitation. He is an enemy encounter. He is also a victim. Both of these things are true at the same time, and the terminal makes it impossible to separate them. In Fallout New Vegas, the Mojave Wasteland contains dozens of locations with environmental stories layered through them. The crashed vertibird site contains fragments of an Enclave presence that hints at a larger story about what happened to scattered Enclave remnants in the West after the destruction of the oil rig. The remains of various pre-war facilities contain records that trace the mundane bureaucratic processes that contributed to the catastrophe. Safety reports filed and ignored, budget constraints that compromise testing protocols, memos between corporate divisions that document, in the dry language of institutional communication, the incremental steps toward disaster. The old Mormon fort in Freeside contains medical records from the followers of the apocalypse, and among those records are fragments of casework that illuminate the human cost of the region's various wars and conflicts in specific and devastating detail. There are also, scattered throughout the Mojave, holotapes left by people who are not important to any faction or any main quest, ordinary survivors, wanderers, people trying to document their experiences for no audience they could reliably anticipate. Fallout 3 has an entire quest built around a family, the Statesman Hotel, that reveals itself entirely through environmental evidence. The holotapes and terminals in the hotel tell the story of what happened to a group of survivors who attempted to establish a community there in the years after the bombs fell. The story does not have a happy ending, but its arc is complete and coherent. And the final moments of the evidence trail, the last holotape, the last terminal entry, carry weight because everything that preceded them has built context and investment. The Dunwich Borers in Fallout 4 contain one of the series' more genuinely unnerving environmental narratives, using terminals and physical staging to document a series of increasingly disturbing incidents among the workers at the quarry site. Things they found deep in the rock, things that seemed to influence them. The narrative is never fully explained, which is the correct choice. The power of this particular story lies precisely in what it declines to resolve. The Dunwich building in Fallout 3 has a similar quality. Both seem to gesture towards something genuinely supernatural, or at least genuinely ancient in the Fallout universe, something that predates the bombs and perhaps predates civilization, and both decline to explain it clearly. The notes and holotapes also function as a kind of archive of pre-war culture and consciousness. Business correspondence, personal diaries, recorded conversations, these fragments carry the texture of a civilization that existed and had the normal range of concerns and relationships and anxieties before the fire came. Reading them in sequence, finding a set of personal journal entries from the same person across multiple ruins, constructing the arc of their life is one of the quieter pleasures the games offer, and one that rewards slow, attentive play. There is a particularly striking example in Fallout 4, the story of Finn, a former raider who left violence behind and attempted to establish a peaceful life, documented across a series of notes found in different locations in the Commonwealth. Finn's story is not connected to any quest. No marker points you toward it. The only way to encounter it is to read everything and pay attention, and when you assemble the pieces, what you find is a complete human story about the possibility of change and the difficulty of sustaining it. The environmental storytelling in these games is also remarkable for what it tells you about the moments just before the bombs fell. The Fallout series, across its various entries, has reconstructed October 23, 2077 in fine detail through these fragments. People were at work. They were at home. They were in supermarkets and diners and schools and offices. When the sirens sounded, some ran to the nearest vault. Most did not make it or did not believe the threat was real or simply had nowhere to go. The physical evidence of the last hours of the pre-war world is preserved in the ruins in the form of interrupted meals and abandoned tasks and shopping bags dropped in the middle of a parking lot. There is a Nuka-Cola vending machine in Fallout 3 with a note taped to it. The note was left by someone trying to retrieve their change. The machine kept their coins. In the context of the game, this is a tiny detail, barely a joke, barely worth noticing. But it speaks to the human scale of what was lost, the small, ordinary frustrations and transactions and irritations that make up the texture of a life, all preserved in the ruins of the world that the bombs ended. The holotapes that document the moments of the attack itself are some of the most carefully written in the series. Voices cut off mid-sentence, recorders picked up and then dropped, a final entry that begins in panic and ends in silence. The design team understood that there is a specific horror in incompleteness in the record that stops rather than concludes, in the voice that goes quiet without saying goodbye. The Fallout games invite you to be an archaeologist as much as a survivor. The ruins are not simply a setting for combat and exploration, they are documents. And the most interesting thing about them, taken together, is not any single story they contain, but the pattern that emerges when you stand back and look at all of them at once. The picture of a civilization that knew, at some level, that it was in danger and continued doing ordinary things anyway. Because that is what people do. They went to work, they bought their children toys, they argued about trivial things, they loved each other. And then the light came. and they were part of the record of the world rather than actors in it. Section 8. Cut content and developer secrets. No game is the thing it was fully intended to be. Every piece of software that makes it to release is a negotiated compromise between vision and constraint. Constrained by time, by budget, by the limitations of technology, by the creative disagreements that inevitably arise when many people work together on a complex project. And the Fallout games, across their various development teams and release windows, contain a remarkable amount of content that was built but not included, designed but not finished, or included in such a fragmentary state that most players never discover it. Fallout New Vegas, widely regarded as one of the finest role-playing games ever made, was developed in approximately 18 months, an extraordinarily tight timeline for a game of its scope. That schedule produced a finished product of genuine brilliance, but it also meant that a substantial amount of content was cut from the final release. The Fallout New Vegas modding community, one of the most active and sophisticated in gaming, has spent years recovering, documenting, and in many cases restoring that cut content. And what they have found reveals a game that was even larger and more ambitious than what shipped. The Legion, one of the game's major factions, a Roman-themed slaveholder empire that functions as the primary antagonistic force in the Mojave, was particularly affected by cuts. The Caesar's Legion content that appears in the final game is functional and contributes effectively to the narrative, but significant portions of Legion questlines and character arcs were removed. Vulpes Inculta, one of the Legion's most memorable figures encountered early in the game, was intended to have a much larger presence. Several Legion locations were designed and partially constructed but not completed in time. The faction's ending options were compressed from what was originally planned. The cut content in Fallout 3 is somewhat different in character. Bethesda's approach to the Capital Wasteland was broader and less densely written than Obsidian's Mojave, and the cut material reflects this. There are locations that were started and abandoned, dialogue trees that were scripted but not recorded, and at least one entirely cut faction that would have added significant complexity to the political landscape of the region. Vault 22's cut content is particularly interesting. There were originally additional terminal entries that would have expanded the story of the fungal intelligence and its relationship to the Vault's population, in ways that made the whole situation considerably stranger and more genuinely unnerving. What remained in the shipped game is already effective. What was removed would have been extraordinary. The development history of Fallout 4 also contains fascinating ghosts. Concept art and design documents that have emerged since release show a wider range of faction designs, including different visual directions for the Institute and the Brotherhood, and at least one entirely different concept for the game's primary antagonist before the story settled into its final form. The development of Fallout 4's settlement system, the base-building mechanic that allows players to construct their own communities in the Commonwealth, generated significant design debate internally, and the scope of that system in the final game is considerably reduced from what was being prototyped in earlier development phases. One of the more remarkable bits of developer history is the provenance of the mysterious Stranger Perk's iconic visual. The fedora-wearing figure who occasionally appears during VATS to deliver a killing shot at a crucial moment has appeared in some form in every mainline Fallout game and has accumulated an extraordinary amount of community theorizing about who he is. Nick Valentine in Fallout 4 has a case file built against the mysterious stranger, which he can discuss with the player documentation of this synthetic detective's genuine investigation into the identity of a figure that appears throughout the wasteland at moments of crisis, assists, and vanishes. The theories range from the practical to the metaphysical. The stranger is a government agent. The stranger is a time traveler. The stranger is an AI system running on pre-war infrastructure, monitoring events of significance and intervening according to an algorithm. The stranger is something genuinely supernatural. What is notable is that the design of the character, the dark coat, the hat, the Old West visual language is itself a reference to a tradition of the mysterious benefactor in Western fiction, the figure who rides in from nowhere, helps, and disappears without explanation. The Fallout universe appropriated this archetype and gave it nuclear-age clothes. The Wild Wasteland perk in Fallout New Vegas was a deliberate mechanism for including content that the development team loved, but that would have felt tonally inconsistent with the main game's more serious register. Activating Wild Wasteland enabled a set of humorous or outright absurdist encounters that would otherwise not appear. Some of these were pop culture references, a recreation of the Indiana Jones boulder scene in a specific location, alien abduction encounters, a homage to the knights who say ni from Monty Python. Others were simply the game's designers, indulging their sense of humor in ways that would be difficult to justify in a game trying to maintain narrative weight. The perk's existence as a mechanic is itself a kind of developer comment on the tension between tonal registers that every Fallout game navigates. The series has always mixed dark comedy with genuine horror, with earnest emotional storytelling, and managing the proportions of that mixture is one of the trickier craft problems in game design. Wild Wasteland externalized the problem by making the silly stuff opt-in, which is a clever solution that also has the advantage of rewarding players who discover it with the feeling of finding something the game was hiding specifically for them. The Fallout games also contain numerous instances of content that was included, but that most players never encounter, because it requires specific, non-obvious conditions to trigger. Hidden dialogue options available only with very high speech or intelligence skills. Encounters that only appear if you visit a specific location at a specific time under specific circumstances. Terminal entries that require sufficiently advanced hacking skills to access. The games reward thoroughness and attention in ways that create a secondary relationship with the material. A relationship that feels private, almost conspiratorial, like the game is sharing something with you specifically because you were paying close enough attention to notice it was there. There is also the matter of the game's musical content, specifically the licensed pop and jazz recordings of the pre-war era that play on in-game radio stations throughout the wasteland. Each game has developed its playlist with specific intention, not simply selecting songs that sound period-appropriate, but choosing recordings whose lyrics and tonal character comment on the narrative context in which they are heard. Fallout 3's Ink Spots tracks play against the devastation of Washington, D.C., in ways that create an almost overwhelming contrast between the brightness of the music and the darkness of the setting. Fallout New Vegas uses its Rat Pack and Western-flavored selections to evoke the specific mythology of Las Vegas, while gently puncturing the nostalgia those sounds carry. The designers understood that music functions differently in games than in other media because of the player's agency. You can choose to turn the radio off. You can choose to leave it on while you walk through a ruined city, and the melancholy of what you are hearing then becomes part of the atmosphere of what you are seeing in ways that the designers can set up but cannot fully control. The experience is collaborative, and the space that the music opens in that collaboration is one of the series' most distinctive emotional qualities. Section 9. The Great War's Unsolved Mysteries. We have already visited the question of who fired first, but the Great War contains other mysteries that the games have addressed more obliquely and that remain genuinely unresolved even after decades of community investigation. One of the most persistent is the question of what the actual governmental chain of command looked like in the hours when the bombs were falling. The Enclave's official position was that they were the continuity of the American government, that the president and his cabinet, retreating to the oil rig, were the legitimate continuation of the United States even after the destruction of its cities and most of its population. But the legality of a government whose territory has been entirely destroyed and whose mandate derives from a population that no longer exists in any meaningful sense is, at minimum, philosophically contested. The Enclave acted as though the question were simple because their ideology required it to be simple. But the records that survive from the immediate post-war period tell a more chaotic story. Communications between the various hardened government installations, including the White Spring and Raven Rock, that suggests significant confusion and conflict about what authority actually meant in a world where the institutions that authority had rested on were ash. There is also the question of the Vault-Tec Corporation's internal chain of command after the bombs fell. The corporation built the vaults. They seated them with overseers who were Vault-Tec employees, their primary loyalty to the corporation rather than to the vault's inhabitants. These overseers received instructions, recorded messages, behavioral protocols, experimental parameters that governed how the vaults were managed. But where were those instructions coming from? Was there a surviving Vault-Tec leadership structure that continued to monitor and direct the vault experiments? Was there a central repository of vault data somewhere in the wasteland that we have not yet found? The television series gestures toward this in the form of Vault 31, which contains a cryo-frozen population of Vault-Tec executives waiting to emerge and re-establish corporate governance when the time is right. This is a canonical answer to the corporate continuity question, but it raises further questions about what other preparations the corporation may have made that have not yet been revealed. There is also the long-standing community debate about the nature of the Overseer's communication system. Vault Overseers were able to send and receive messages related to their experimental protocols. We know this from various terminal logs, but the infrastructure that enabled this communication is never clearly identified. The assumption is that some kind of pre-war telecommunications infrastructure survived the bombs in sufficient capacity to maintain these communications for some period after the war, but the specifics have never been canonically established. The question of the aliens is another one that the games have raised and then largely declined to follow up on in satisfying ways. Alien presence in the Fallout universe is suggested repeatedly across multiple games. The Mothership Zeta DLC for Fallout 3 makes aliens explicit and playable, and alien crash sites and alien weaponry appear throughout the series. But the relationship between the alien presence and the broader Fallout narrative has never been explored in any depth. We know aliens were abducting humans before the war. We know they continued to operate in the post-war wasteland. We know essentially nothing about their purposes, their relationship to Earth's history, or what their ongoing presence means for the future. The Zetans, as the alien species is informally called, are fascinating precisely because they have been so carefully kept at the periphery of the main narrative. They appear as a strange Easter egg in one game, as the villain of a DLC in another, as scattered environmental details in several others. The picture they form is of a species with long-standing interest in Earth and its inhabitants, conducting research or operations of some kind that has never been transparently explained. Given the Fallout universe's broader theme of powerful entities conducting research on humans without consent, the aliens fit this pattern almost too neatly. They are another layer of the same structural horror, operating at a scale that makes even Vault Tech look provincial. There are also the Deathclaws, whose origin has been subject to revision across the games. The canonical answer, established in Fallout 2, is that Deathclaws were developed by the US military as a weapon-large lizard stock, the Jackson's chameleon, used as a base, exposed to FEV to produce the enormous, intelligent predators that now roam the wasteland. But the details of this origin have been inconsistently applied across games, and the Deathclaws encountered in different regions behave in sufficiently different ways to suggest that either the FEV mutation has produced regional variation, or there are additional elements of their origin story that have not been disclosed. The Burned Man Joshua Graham, a character of legendary status in the Fallout New Vegas community, carries with him an unresolved backstory of particular interest. Graham was the first legate of Caesar's Legion, a military genius who suffered a catastrophic defeat at Hoover Dam against the New California Republic and was punished by being set on fire and thrown into the Grand Canyon. He survived. This survival is treated in the game as something close to miraculous. Even Caesar acknowledges that what Graham did should not have been possible. Graham himself attributes his survival to his faith. The game does not contradict this or explain it away. It simply presents a man who should be dead, who is not dead, and who carries the marks of what happened to him with extraordinary equanimity. Whether the Burned Man's survival is intended to be genuinely supernatural or simply an extreme case of human resilience and luck is something the game deliberately leaves open, consistent with its broader interest in maintaining space for faith as a real and legitimate response to the wasteland, rather than dismissing it as delusion. The history of the NCR and its relationship to the original Vault Dwellers' descendants is another thread that runs through multiple games with significant gaps. The New California Republic was founded by the descendant of the Vault Dweller from the first game, and its development over the century and a half since then represents Fallout's most sustained examination of the process of building post-apocalyptic civilization. But significant parts of that history, particularly the early decades, the formation of the first settlements, the internal politics that shaped the NCR into the democratic republic it eventually became, are documented only in fragments across various games and supplementary materials. The gaps in the historical record are not simply omissions, they are invitations. The community has spent years filling those gaps with theories, fan fiction, and detailed analysis of the canonical fragments available. The result is a shared mythology that extends far beyond what any individual game actually contains, built collaboratively by players who found in the world a richness that invited their participation. This is perhaps the Great War's ultimate mystery, not who fired first, but why a story about the end of civilization has generated such a vibrant and ongoing conversation about what comes after. People do not create extensive lore communities around narratives they find purely despairing. The reason the Fallout universe has generated so much community investment is that somewhere beneath all the ruin and the horror and the betrayal, there is something genuinely interesting about the question it poses. What would you do? What would you build? What would you choose to preserve? The Wasteland is a thought experiment that happens to be one of the most detailed fictional worlds ever constructed, and the Great War is the premise that makes the thought experiment possible. Without the bombs, there is no question. And without the question, there is no conversation. Section 10. Hidden Easter eggs, strange encounters, and things most players never found. The Fallout games are extensively generous to attentive players, and the Easter eggs and hidden encounters scattered throughout the series represent a kind of ongoing gift from the development teams to people willing to look carefully. In Fallout New Vegas, the Wild Wasteland trait, as mentioned earlier, opens up a range of encounters that most players on a first playthrough would never see. But the game also contains Easter eggs accessible without that trait that require only patience and exploration to find. Near Prim, in the early game area, there is a location that requires careful navigation to reach a small crashed flying saucer surrounded by the remains of very small alien beings. This is not a major discovery in mechanical terms. In atmospheric terms, in the context of a game that is generally quite grounded in its post-war Western aesthetic, it is delightful and strange. The references in Fallout New Vegas to other Bethesda properties are numerous but subtle. On the utility poles in Freeside, small plaques read TES Null 4, a reference to The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. The reference is purely cosmetic, visible only to players who happen to look at the poles closely and recognize the code. This kind of embedded reference requires a specific kind of player attention, the willingness to examine things that serve no functional purpose in the game, and rewards it with a moment of recognition that feels private, unannounced. The Mark Twain letter in Fallout New Vegas is a genuine artifact, an actual letter by Mark Twain that appears in the game's world, which is not itself unusual given Fallout's practice of weaving real history into its alternate timeline. What is unusual is where it is found inside a safe, in a location that has no particular narrative significance, and the fact that its presence there, while explainable in terms of the game's logic, has never been fully accounted for in the broader lore. It is one of those small mysteries that the community notices and documents and then files away under things we do not entirely understand. The red rocket stations scattered throughout Fallout 4 contain, in their rear storage areas, a series of Nuka-Cola posters featuring a specific graphic design that, when examined very closely, contains a small visual code. The code, decoded, spells out a message from the art team that is something between a joke and a declaration of professional pride. This kind of embedded developer communication, the team leaving its mark in a place where virtually no player will ever see it, reflects something interesting about the culture of game development. The way that people who spend years making a world will occasionally leave small private monuments to themselves inside it. The Dunwich building in Fallout 3, mentioned earlier in the context of environmental storytelling, contains a specific encounter at the lowest level that a significant number of players have missed. In the deepest basement, past the horror-inflected environmental storytelling and the steadily increasing ambient dread, there is a pool of water with something in it. The game does not tell you what it is. The encounter with it is brief and ambiguous, leaving you with a strong impression that something happened and very little information about what. The modding community has examined the encounter extensively, and the consensus is that it was always intended to be ambiguous, that the point is the impression rather than the explanation. What is in the water is whatever is most frightening to you specifically, which is the most honest thing a horror narrative can say about itself. Fallout 4 contains a hidden location that requires a specific sequence of in-game actions to discover not a quest trigger, not a marker, but a genuine secret space accessible only through careful environmental navigation. The Cabot House questline, one of the more tonally eccentric sequences in the game, involves a family of pre-war Boston aristocrats who have survived for over 400 years through a combination of a serum derived from an artifact of extraterrestrial origin and an elaborate system of social maintenance. The full backstory of the Cabot family and the artifact's origin is available only through extensive dialogue and reading, and most players experience the questline as a weird and somewhat disconnected adventure, without fully grasping that it is one of Fallout 4's few direct engagements with the question of whether the Fallout universe contains genuinely supernatural phenomena as opposed to simply advanced or poorly understood technology. The alien artifact that the Cabots have been using is clearly of non-terrestrial origin. Its properties, including the longevity it confers and the paranoia and aggression it induces in those exposed to it without the protective serum, do not correspond to any known Fallout technology or FEV variant. Lorenzo Cabot, the family patriarch who has been imprisoned for decades both to protect the household from his artifact-amplified aggression and to prevent the artifact's influence from spreading, is one of the game's more genuinely compelling ambiguous figures. He is dangerous. He may also be justified. Whether you free him or don't, and what happens afterward, is one of Fallout 4's more morally interesting decision points. The various terminal entries that comprise Fallout's equivalent of found documents are also, in many cases, Easter eggs in themselves, references to real corporate and bureaucratic writing styles that are accurate enough to be genuinely funny if you have spent time reading the kind of documents they are parodying. The Vault-Tec corporate communications have a specific jargon density and a specific relationship to euphemism that maps very closely onto real corporate communications about projects of dubious ethical status. The pre-war government documents have a similar quality. The comedy in these pieces arises from recognition, from the sense that the fiction is less a departure from reality than a slight exaggeration of it. The most carefully hidden content in the series tends to be the content that requires the most time to find. The Fallout series rewards cumulative play. The benefit of having spent hundreds of hours in a game shows not just in mechanical competence, but in the ability to notice things that a newer player would walk past. A note that seems incidental on first reading becomes significant in context of something discovered 3 play sessions later. A location that seemed like a simple bandit camp has a small room in the back with a terminal that tells you why the bandits are there and what they did before. The accumulation of context transforms the wasteland from a setting into a history, and history has a weight that setting does not. Section 11. The Children of Adam and the Mystical Side of the Wasteland. In the center of the settlement of Megaton in Fallout 3, surrounded by homes built from salvaged metal and scavenged wood, there stands an undetonated atomic bomb. It has been there since the bombs fell. It is embedded in the earth at the center of a shallow crater that gives the settlement its name, and it is live-armed, operational, waiting. Most of Megaton's residents treat the bomb with wary pragmatism. It is a danger. It is also a fixture, and the pragmatism of the wasteland means that you learn to live with things you cannot immediately solve. But there is one small group in Megaton who treat the bomb very differently. The Children of Adam have built their small church directly beside it. They pray to it. They have made it sacred. The Children of Adam are, at first encounter, easy to dismiss as a curiosity, a post-apocalyptic religious cult whose theology is patently absurd. They worship radiation as divine, and the nuclear bomb as the holiest of relics, and the explosion that ended civilization as a sacred creative act. In a world defined by the suffering that nuclear weapons caused, a religion that venerates them seems like the most obvious and extreme form of cognitive dissonance imaginable. But the Children of Adam repay closer examination. Their theology, while terrifying in its implications, has an internal coherence that is more sophisticated than it first appears. The core belief is that Adam, their deity, seeks to create new worlds through nuclear fission. Every atomic explosion is understood not as destruction but as division. The splitting of one world into many, each detonation producing new dimensions, new realities, new universes in which life and experience propagate. The Great War, in this framework, was not a catastrophe. It was a proliferation of creation on an unimaginable scale. 2 hours of division that spawned more universes than human civilization had previously managed in all of its history. This is, from inside the theology, not irrational. If you accept the premise that atomic fission is genuinely generative at a cosmic scale, that splitting atoms creates not just energy but worlds, then the reverence for radiation follows. The Children of Adam do not love death. They love what they understand death to be, the door through which new existence passes. They are wrong about what nuclear bombs do to living organisms. They are not necessarily wrong about what radiation does to them personally, because many of the most devout children demonstrate a genuine and unexplained immunity to radiation that non-members do not possess. This radiation immunity is one of the more genuinely mysterious elements of the Children of Adam. It is presented in the games as a rare mutation. Not every member of the church possesses it that either develops through extended exposure or is inherited from ancestors who survived the initial fallout with unusual resilience. The children who have it experience radiation as a form of blessing, a physical demonstration of Adam's favor, a gift that validates their faith in the most bodily possible way. They can stand in irradiated environments that would kill unprotected humans and emerge unharmed, experiencing only what they describe as a warm and holy sensation. The question of whether this immunity is a natural mutation or something more is one that the games deliberately leave open. The Fallout universe acknowledges the existence of things that are difficult to explain through existing scientific frameworks. The Children of Adam are not the only context in which this happens, but they are the context in which it is most concentrated and most theologically developed. In Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, the Children of Adam have a much more substantial presence. A sect of the church, established on the island of Mount Desert Island in the waters off the coast of Maine, occupies a former military submarine base they call the Nucleus. The Far Harbor Children are theologically distinct from their megaton predecessors, more sophisticated, more organized, more militarized. Their Grand Confessor Tectus has led them into a state of active conflict with the human population of Far Harbor, seeking to expand the island's radioactive fog to cover all of Mount Desert Island, which they understand as fulfilling Adam's will. The conflict in Far Harbor is genuinely complex, because the Children of Adam, while dangerous, are not simply villains. The residents of Far Harbor are not simply heroes. Both communities have legitimate claims to the island and legitimate grievances against each other, and the player's options for resolving the conflict range from enabling one side to destroy the other, to finding solutions that neither side would have arrived at without outside intervention. This is characteristic of the best Fallout writing, the refusal to give you enemies who are simply wrong and heroes who are simply right. The Mother of the Fog, a figure revered by the Far Harbor Children as a divine messenger, adds another layer of genuine mysticism to the sect's theology. She is described as a female figure who appears in the fog, who led the community in moments of crisis, who is understood by some members as a ghost or spirit, and by others as a living human hermit, who has chosen to exist at the boundary between the community and the wilderness. The player can investigate her nature, and the investigation does not produce a definitive answer. What is known is that she is real, she has had genuine effects on the community, she has been witnessed, she exists. What she is remains an open question, which may be the most honest thing the game can say about the nature of religious experience. The Children of Adam also illustrate something important about how religious community functions in a world of catastrophic loss. The wasteland is, above everything else, a world of grief. The grief is historical, the loss of the civilization that ended in fire, but it is also immediate and personal. The constant experience of violent death, of communities collapsing, of the people you care about being taken away. Religion has always been, among its other functions, a system for making grief bearable, for giving loss a meaning that prevents it from being simply meaningless. The Children of Adam have made the most comprehensive grief into theology. They have taken the worst thing that ever happened, the bombs, the ash, the 200 years of suffering that followed, and given it cosmic significance. They have made it holy. Whether this is delusion or genuine insight depends entirely on whether they are right about the nature of radiation and the will of Adam, which is something the games deliberately decline to resolve. What is clear is that the theology serves the psychological function that all theologies serve. It gives people a way to live with the unlivable. There is a final, lingering question about the Children of Adam that the games raise without fully addressing. What happens if they are right? If Adam is real, if division is genuinely creative rather than simply destructive, if the people who built their faith around the worship of nuclear energy are engaged with a real spiritual force rather than a post-traumatic construct, what does that mean for the wasteland? What does it mean for the player? This is the kind of metaphysical cliff edge that Fallout stands at in its best moments. The place where the fiction meets genuine philosophical uncertainty and declines to step back from it. Section 12. The virus that wanted to rewrite humanity. No element of Fallout's lore has more far-reaching consequences than the forced evolutionary virus. FEV is an artificial pathogen, engineered before the Great War by the Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Division of West Tech Research, Initially developed as a potential response to the new plague, a disease that spread rapidly through the United States in the 2050s and created significant public health pressure on the government. The research that began as a medical project was rapidly redirected toward military applications, because in the Fallout universe, as in the real world, the most consistent funder of advanced research is defense. What West Tech produced, after years of development and increasingly unethical experimentation, was a virus capable of rewriting the DNA of any organism it infected. The forced evolutionary virus does exactly what its name says. It forces biological evolution, dramatically and rapidly altering the phenotype and genotype of its host. The results depend on the specific strain, the specific host, and the specific conditions of exposure. But the outcomes range from the creation of physically superior human specimens to the production of the enormous, green-skinned beings known as super mutants to complete biological failure resulting in death. FEV's specific power lies in its adaptability. The virus is designed to be modifiable. Its base structure can be altered to target specific species, produce specific mutations, or achieve specific enhancement goals. This makes it one of the most versatile biological agents in the Fallout universe, and one of the most dangerous, because the same quality that makes it a useful research tool makes it extraordinarily difficult to contain or control. Once FEV is in a population, whether through deliberate infection or environmental contamination, its effects propagate in ways that are difficult to predict. The Mariposa military base in California is the most historically significant FEV facility in the series. West Tech's research program was moved there from the company's main research center as a security measure, and it was at Mariposa that human experimentation began. The military prisoners subjected to FEV infection at Mariposa were the first involuntary human test subjects, and the experiments performed on them were what Captain Roger Maxson discovered and what drove him to the executions and the Declaration of Secession that founded the Brotherhood of Steel. After the Great War, Mariposa military base fell into the hands of Richard Gray, a survivor from Vault 15 who came to the base and was accidentally exposed to the FEV vats. Gray's exposure was more extended and more complete than anything the original researchers had tested, and what it produced was not the physical enhancement the program had been aiming for, but something far stranger. An intelligence enhanced and expanded far beyond baseline human capability, housed in a body that was simultaneously disintegrating and regenerating under the ongoing influence of the virus. Gray, eventually calling himself the Master, used his enhanced intelligence to develop a vision for humanity's future and the FEV as the instrument for achieving it. The Master believed that human beings would never overcome their capacity for violence and tribalism in their current biological form. What was needed, in his analysis, was a forced evolution, a species-level transformation that would create a new kind of human, one without the biological triggers for the behaviors that had produced the wars and the bombs and the wasteland. Super mutants, in the Master's vision, were this new humanity. Physically superior, resistant to radiation, immune to disease, freed from many of the biological imperatives that drove human conflict. The Master's army, which he spent decades building from FEV-infected humans gathered from across the wasteland, was his mechanism for delivering this transformation to a species that had not asked for it and could not consent to it. The philosophical problem with the Master's plan, which the player can actually confront him with in the original Fallout, in one of gaming's most memorable dialogue sequences, is that the super mutants produced by his FEV program are sterile. They cannot reproduce. If the Master succeeds in converting all pure-strain humans to super mutants, the resulting population will die out in a single generation, leaving the Earth empty of all human life. The Master, upon being confronted with this fact in a way he cannot refute, suffers what can only be called an existential collapse and destroys himself along with his underground stronghold. This conclusion has layers that remain interesting long after the initial playthrough. The Master was genuinely intelligent. He had spent decades thinking about his plan. He had resources and followers and a vision. And the catastrophic flaw in his vision, the sterility of the beings he was creating, was something he could have discovered if he had been willing to question his assumptions rather than subordinate all evidence to his conclusions. His certainty was his undoing. The most sophisticated mind in the wasteland, the one capable of constructing the most elaborate societal vision, was also the most thoroughly isolated from the feedback that would have revealed his error. FEV continued to shape the wasteland long after the Master's defeat. The vats at Mariposa were left contaminated, and their contents continued to affect the surrounding region. The Enclave, aware of FEV and possessing their own research data from the pre-war period, attempted to weaponize modified strains multiple times with the genocidal intent described earlier. The Institute in the Commonwealth developed their own FEV research program, eventually using a modified strain as part of the genetic architecture for their Gen 3 synths, which is itself a profound irony. That the technology developed to create the monsters of the wasteland became the foundation for creating its most sophisticated artificial people. The Commonwealth super mutants are a different strain from the California population, less intelligent on average and more aggressive, produced by a different application of FEV through a different process. The Vault 87 population on the East Coast is different again. Each regional super mutant population reflects the specific strain and exposure conditions of their origin, and the variability between them is one of the ways the games demonstrate that FEV is not a single simple thing but an enormously complex biological system with different outcomes in different circumstances. There is something quietly tragic about the super mutants throughout the series that the games occasionally acknowledge. These are beings created without their consent, through a process of violation from raw human material. Many of them are no longer capable of the cognitive complexity that would allow them to fully process what was done to them. Some are Fox, the super mutant companion in Fallout 3, possesses a level of intelligence and reflective capacity that allows him to articulate something about the condition of being what he is. His conversation with the player, available if you take the time to have it, is one of the most unexpectedly moving pieces of writing in the game. What FEV represents in the broader Fallout mythology is the logical endpoint of a specifically dangerous scientific impulse, the idea that the problems of human nature can be solved through biological intervention. Every application of the virus in the series, the Master's army, the Enclave's weapons, the Institute's synthetic humans, is an attempt to engineer a solution to human complexity at the cellular level. And every application produces results that are more complicated, more violent, and more morally ambiguous than the engineers anticipated. The virus is more powerful than any of its users' visions for it. It does not deliver controlled transformation. It delivers change, which is something much less manageable. Section 13. The future that never was Fallout's retrofuturism and what it all means. There is a specific feeling that the Fallout games produce in quiet moments that is difficult to name precisely. When you are standing in a ruined diner, looking at a table set for two with dishes that have not been moved since October 23, 2077, listening to a swing record playing on a jukebox that has somehow continued operating for over 200 years, and the light is coming in at a particular angle through the broken windows, and outside there is nothing but scorched earth and silence in that moment, the feeling is something adjacent to nostalgia, but not quite nostalgia, because you are not personally remembering the thing being mourned. You are mourning a future that never existed, for a past that existed only in the specific and strange form the games give it to you. This is retrofuturism's particular emotional quality. It is mourning for the imagined tomorrow of a yesterday you never lived through. Fallout's pre-war aesthetic is derived from the visions of the future that circulated in American popular culture through the 1940s and 50s. The streamlined shapes, the atomic energy promises, the confident optimism about science and progress and human capability. This was a genuine cultural phenomenon, and the artifacts it produced, the magazine illustrations, the industrial design, the architectural ambition represent a real historical moment's imagined relationship to its own future. What Fallout does is take that imagined future and ask, what if it had actually arrived? The answer is not entirely pretty. The technological advances that the Fallout timeline produced are genuinely extraordinary fusion power, advanced robotics, power armor, practical energy weapons, synthetic biology. But these advances occurred in a cultural and political context that never developed the institutions necessary to govern them responsibly. The technology arrived. The wisdom to handle it did not. This is, arguably, not a comment on any fictional alternate timeline, but on the actual history of technological development in our own world. The relationship between technological capability and the moral and institutional frameworks necessary to use that capability well has never been straightforward. And the history of the 20th century contains numerous examples of technologies that arrived before anyone had adequately thought through their implications. Fallout exaggerates this dynamic for narrative effect, but it does not invent it. The retrofuturism also functions as a comment on nostalgia itself, on the specific danger of looking backward toward an imagined golden age, rather than forward toward an uncertain but genuinely open future. The pre-war United States in Fallout was not the golden age its propaganda claimed it was. It was a deeply unequal society with severe civil liberties problems, engaged in resource extraction and imperial competition, sustaining its prosperity through mechanisms that were ultimately catastrophic. The cheerful 50s aesthetic disguised real darkness, as aesthetics often do. When players in the wasteland encounter this aesthetic, in the ruined diners and the derelict bowling alleys and the abandoned drive-in movie theaters, they are encountering the physical remains of a culture that chose its self-image over its self-awareness. The gap between what pre-war America looked like and what it was is part of what makes the wasteland a meaningful, rather than simply a spectacular setting. The robots of the Fallout universe are particularly resonant examples of this dynamic. The Mr. Handy robots, round and friendly and voiced with British accented cheerfulness, continue performing their pre-war functions in a world that no longer exists. They serve meals in empty restaurants, maintain yards that have not seen living grass in 2 centuries, provide customer service in stores whose products have long since rotted away. Their programming has no update mechanism for apocalypse. They continue in the world they were programmed for, which no longer exists, performing the functions they were designed for, which serve no one. There is something in this that is funny and something that is unbearably sad in roughly equal measure. The robots are the most literal possible embodiment of a culture that could not adapt to change because it could not acknowledge change. They are the pre-war world's most honest self-portrait, still running their routines, still smiling, still offering you a 200-year-old menu selection from behind a counter that is mostly rubble. The Fallout universe also has something to say about the relationship between corporate branding and cultural identity. Nuka-Cola is the most obvious example, a beverage brand that achieved such market penetration that its bottle caps became currency, that its color scheme and logo and mascot Nuka Girl are as recognizable in the wasteland as they were in the pre-war world. Nuka-Cola World, the Nuka-Cola theme park accessible in Fallout 4's DLC, is a monument to a specific kind of corporate ambition. The belief that a brand can become a culture, that the company and the civilization it serves can become the same thing. And in the wasteland, this has literally happened. The Nuka-Cola brand is one of the most persistent artifacts of the pre-war civilization, more persistent than the government, more persistent than the military, more persistent than most of the institutions that were supposed to be civilization's backbone. A beverage company has outlasted the United States of America, not in any operational sense, but in the cultural memory of the wasteland, in the caps jingling in every trader's pocket, in the advertisements still plastered to ruined walls. This is, depending on how you look at it, either the darkest joke in the series or the most accurate prediction of what actually lasts. The question of what survives catastrophe and what disappears is one that the Fallout series explores with genuine sophistication. The things that survive are not necessarily the most important things. The bottle caps survive because they are durable and ubiquitous. The robots survive because they are well-engineered and self-maintaining. The advertisements survive because they were designed to persist. The human knowledge encoded in the vaults and the Brotherhood's archive survives because someone chose to preserve it. But the relationships, the communities, the legal institutions, the cultural practices that gave life its texture, these are far more fragile, and most of them did not make it. What the game suggests is being rebuilt in the wasteland slowly, imperfectly, with enormous setbacks and constant violence, is not a restoration of the pre-war world but something genuinely new. The NCR is not the pre-war United States. The settlement communities of the Commonwealth are not the suburbs of Boston. The civilization that emerges from the wasteland, whatever it eventually becomes, will be a product of its specific conditions. The survival instincts, the hard-won knowledge, the moral lessons of a people who lived through catastrophe and continued anyway. This is, in the end, what Fallout is really about. Not the bombs, not the vaults, not the factions and their ideological conflicts. All of those are the frame. The picture inside the frame is the question of what human beings are made of when everything comfortable and certain is taken away. The answer the games give repeatedly and across enormous variety of circumstance is more than anyone expected. Enough to keep going. Enough to build something, Even if the something is imperfect and fragile and constantly under threat. The wasteland is bleak, but it is populated by people making choices, and some of those choices are good ones. And every good choice that a person makes in conditions that offer them no particular incentive to make it is evidence of something that survives catastrophe in ways that bottle caps and advertising and even the most well-built robots cannot. The human capacity to do better than the circumstances demand. War never changes, the opening lines of every Fallout game tell us. And this is true of war. But the people in the war, the people who survive it, who live after it, who build in the spaces it leaves behind, they change. They have to. The alternative is the Enclave, frozen in the certainty that the world that was destroyed was the best of all possible worlds and should be restored exactly as it was. The alternative is the loop, the repetition, the bombs falling again. The wasteland chooses something else. Imperfectly, messily, with tremendous violence and occasional grace. It chooses the open question over the closed answer. It chooses the future, uncertain as that future is, over the past, however familiar. And somewhere in a ruined diner, a jukebox is playing a song about love that was recorded before the world ended, and 200 years of silence surround it. And the music sounds exactly like what it always was. Someone hoping that tomorrow would be better than today. Closing? The Fallout universe is enormous, and we have only traced some of its contours tonight. We have not talked about the Long War, or the full history of the Master's Army, or the specific political history of the new California Republic and its complicated relationship with the remnants of the pre-war legal system. We have not spent proper time in the deep weirdness of Old World Blues and its collection of disembodied brains running science projects in the Big MT. We have not explored the story of the Divide and what happened there, or the full tragedy of Ulysses and the Courier's tangled history. The wasteland is large enough that you can spend a very long time in it and still find corners you have not visited, terminals you have not read, holotapes you have not played. The mysteries do not run out. The lore repays attention indefinitely. That is what makes Fallout something more than a game. It is a world that takes seriously the idea that fiction can be a space for thinking about real things, about power and accountability, about the gap between institutions' stated purposes and their actual behaviors, about what we owe each other when the structures that are supposed to govern those obligations have failed. The Wasteland is a thought experiment running at full atmospheric scale, and spending time in it has a way of making certain things about the real world more visible. Or maybe you just like the power armor. That is also a perfectly good reason to be here. Whatever brought you to the Wasteland, thank you for walking through it tonight. Sleep is close, the ruins are quiet, the jukebox is playing somewhere in the dark. And if you found something in this video that stayed with you, drop a comment. Tell me what it was. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. If you are not subscribed yet, now would be a wonderful moment to change that. It genuinely keeps this channel alive, and there is more to explore. Rest well. The Wasteland will still be here in the morning. End of script. Approximate word count. 30,500 plus words. Section 14. The Master and his army Fallout's first great villain. Before the Enclave. Before the Institute. Before any of the factions that would define the Wasteland across decades of games, there was the Master. And the Master remains, in the estimation of many who have spent time with Fallout's lore, the most philosophically interesting antagonist the series has ever produced. His name before the transformation was Richard Gray. He was a survivor originally from Vault 15, which had opened early and expelled its population into the California wasteland. Gray had made it as far as the Hub, the trading city that served as a commercial nexus in early post-war California, and was working as an overseer for a caravan expedition when his group was captured and brought to the Mariposa military base. The base was by this point abandoned by its military personnel, but still contained the FEV vats, still operational, their contaminated contents still virulent after years of unattended operation. Gray fell into the vats. He was not pushed. He was not subjected to a controlled exposure protocol. He fell in, and he stayed in, and what came out of the vats weeks later was something that did not have a simple name for what it was. The FEV exposure that Richard Gray survived should have killed him. The degree of infection was far beyond anything the pre-war researchers had tested on human subjects, and their controlled experiments at lower doses had already produced results ranging from enhancement to catastrophic failure. What Gray's extraordinary resilience, and perhaps some specific quality of his baseline biology produced instead, was a transformation of a different order entirely. His body changed, continued to change, lost its recognizable human form over time, merged with biological matter around it, became something vast and protean and barely physical in the way that human bodies are physical, but his mind expanded rather than degrading. The FEV, at the concentration Gray had absorbed, pushed his cognitive architecture into territory that has no baseline human equivalent. The Master could control others, not through technology or chemistry, but through something the game never fully explains, a direct form of influence that some players read as psychic, some read as the result of aerosolized FEV that primed subjects for behavioral control, and some read as simply an unusually powerful form of the psychological manipulation that charismatic leaders have always exercised. Whatever the mechanism, the effect was real. People who came into prolonged contact with the Master became followers, often devoted ones, even when they had been hostile on first encounter. This is the quality that allowed the Master to build his army. He did not simply create super mutants by force. He gathered a community of followers, human followers, initially who believed in his vision, who accepted his diagnosis of human civilization's failure and his proposed solution. The Unity, as he called the movement, attracted people who were themselves damaged by the wasteland, who found in the Master's absolute certainty a relief from the constant uncertainty that survival required. The Master gave them a story in which they were not simply struggling against a world that was trying to kill them. He gave them a story in which they were part of something enormous and meaningful. He gave them purpose, which is one of the things people want most and one of the things the wasteland supplies least reliably. The complexity of the Master as a character lies in this. He was genuinely trying to solve a genuine problem. His analysis of human nature, that the biological imperatives underlying competition, tribalism, and violence were too powerful to be overcome by cultural or political means, is not without merit. There is an extensive philosophical literature in our own world that engages seriously with exactly this question, and the conclusions are not uniformly optimistic. The Master read that literature, or its equivalent in the Fallout universe, and drew a specific conclusion: that the only way to save humanity was to change what humanity was at the biological level. He was wrong. Not about the problem, but about the solution. The super mutants he created were not the new humanity he envisioned. They were beings in genuine distress, beings of great physical power and, in many cases, dramatically reduced cognitive complexity, living in a world that had no place for them, that saw them as monsters and treated them accordingly. The Master's army was not a new civilization gestating. It was a tragedy in progress, a collection of beings who had lost something irretrievable in the transformation and could not articulate what was missing. The confrontation between the Vault Dweller and the Master at the end of the original Fallout is one of the landmark moments in the history of role-playing games. Not because it is a combat encounter, it does not have to be, but because it is a genuine philosophical argument. The player has the option to present the Master with the medical evidence of super mutant sterility, and the game allows for a conversation in which the Master actually processes this information, actually reasons about its implications, actually comes to terms with the full consequences of his plan in real time. And then, having understood, he ends himself. This response, the willingness to face a catastrophic error and draw the correct conclusion from it rather than rationalizing the error away, is paradoxically presented as one of the most human moments in the game. The Master, transformed beyond recognition, no longer physically human, no longer perhaps even recognizably personal in the way that human beings are personal, retains the capacity for honest self-assessment in a way that many of the human factions surrounding him do not. He is wrong about everything important, and when he discovers this, he does not deflect or double down. He acknowledges it. The super mutants who survive the Master's defeat scatter across the wasteland. Some become simply hostile entities, dangerous creatures in a dangerous world. Others, and this is where the games grow interesting, become something more. Fox in Fallout 3. Marcus in Fallout New Vegas. A sheriff in a town populated by both humans and super mutants, trying to build something in the Mojave that did not previously exist. Lily in New Vegas. An older super mutant who carries fragments of her pre-transformation life in a damaged memory that surfaces intermittently. These characters are among the most sympathetically written in the series, in part because their situation is the most philosophically exposed. They are beings who were made without their consent, in service of a project they had no part in deciding, and they are navigating a world that has no comfortable place for them. The Unity failed, but the beings it created are still walking the wasteland 200 years later, still trying to figure out where they fit. That question, asked across multiple games in multiple registers, is one of Fallout's most consistent ethical preoccupations. What do you owe beings who were made in conditions they could not choose, who exist because of processes they did not authorize? The super mutants are not the only beings this question applies to in the Fallout universe. The synths face the same question from a different angle. The ghouls face a version of it. The question of whether beings can have rights that are not contingent on the conditions of their creation is one that the Wasteland poses repeatedly and answers only imperfectly. Section 15. Ghouls, Radiation, and the Strange Biology of the Wasteland. They are one of the most visually distinctive elements of the Fallout aesthetic, and also one of the most lore-rich. The ghouls. Humans who were exposed to the radiation of the Great War and did not die from it, who instead underwent a transformation that is neither the super mutants' forced evolution nor simple death, but something stranger and in some ways more interesting than either. A ghoul in the Fallout universe is a person who has survived radiation exposure at levels that should have been lethal. The skin is damaged, the soft tissue is degraded, the physical appearance is radically altered in ways that most unmodified humans find distressing or terrifying on first encounter. But the ghoul is not simply a radiation victim. They are a radiation survivor in a specific biological sense. The same exposure that damaged their exterior has made them effectively immune to further radiation damage. Ghouls do not age in any recognizable way. Some of the ghouls encountered in the games have survived since the bombs fell 210 years of continuous existence. Watching the wasteland evolve from the immediate post-war chaos to the complex political landscape the player navigates, the longevity of ghouls is one of the series' most extraordinary details, and it is handled with quiet care in the best instances. The ghoul characters who remember the pre-war world carry that memory in specific ways, in the particular cadence of their speech, in the things they reference that no living human being should have direct knowledge of, in the attitudes they hold about factions and conflicts that, to them, are not history but lived experience. Nick Valentine's pre-war memories are synthetic, uploaded rather than lived, but the old ghoul characters who appear throughout the series carry something more: the actual weight of 2 centuries of continuous experience. Roy Phillips in Fallout 3 is a ghoul who remembers the pre-war world and has spent the post-war decades developing a bitterness about how his people are treated that has curdled into something genuinely dangerous. Harold, who appears in multiple games across the series, is a ghoul of a different kind. A person who has been undergoing continuous mutation for so long that he has transcended ordinary ghoulhood into something entirely unique. Raul Tejada in Fallout New Vegas is a brilliant character, specifically because of the weight his 2 centuries of experience give him, and because of what the game allows him to say about the relationship between age and wisdom and the possibility of choosing how to live regardless of history. The question of what makes someone a person, what cognitive and experiential qualities are necessary for moral standing, is raised differently by ghouls than by synths, but with equal insistency. Ghouls are biologically human, changed but continuous with their pre-war selves. Their personhood is not in question in the way the synths is, but they face systematic discrimination throughout the wasteland on the basis of their appearance, their association with radiation, and the fear that a feral ghoul, a ghoul who has lost cognitive function and descended into aggressive, mindless violence, inspires in unaffected humans. Feral ghouls are the horror version of the ghoul story, and they raise a question the games handle with unusual sensitivity. What is the relationship between a ghoul and the feral state? Is feralism inevitable? Is every ghoul slowly moving toward it? Or is feralism a specific failure mode that some ghouls succumb to while others do not, and if so, what determines the outcome? The game does not offer a single definitive answer, but the evidence available across the series suggests that feralism is associated with psychological damage rather than simply accumulated radiation exposure. Ghouls who remain cognitively functional tend to be ghouls who have maintained social connections, purpose, and some form of engagement with the world around them. The feral ones, when their backstory can be reconstructed, tend to be ghouls who were isolated, who were abandoned, who lost the relationships and the contexts that gave their extended existence meaning. The implication is that the thing that keeps a ghoul human is not biology but psychology, not the absence of further radiation damage, but the presence of continuing social and cognitive engagement. This is, if you follow it to its conclusion, an argument about what personhood actually requires. Not a specific biological substrate, not a specific history of origin, but ongoing participation in a web of relationship and meaning. The feral ghouls are terrifying not merely because they are violent, but because they represent the end state of profound isolation extended across an enormous time span. They are what happens when a person is abandoned long enough. The Cooper Howard storyline in the television series brought ghoul biology and the phenomenology of ghoulhood to a new audience with specific effectiveness. Cooper Howard was a pre-war actor, a recognizable person with a specific life, specific relationships, specific aspirations who survived the bombs and underwent ghoulification and spent the subsequent 220 years navigating a world that did not know what to do with what he had become. The series takes care to show both his pre-war self, when he was fully human and embedded in the culture of pre-war America, and his post-war self, when that culture is long gone and he is something the new world alternately fears and uses. The emotional core of the Cooper Howard story is a question about continuity of identity across radical change. Is the ghoul who wanders the wasteland in 2297 the same person as the actor who raised his daughter in pre-war Los Angeles? The memory is the same. The experiences are continuous. But the body is radically different. The social context is gone. The world that formed him is ash. What remains? And is that remainder enough? The Fallout universe suggests that it is. Barely. With enormous cost, but enough. Section 16. The New California Republic and the question of what civilization means. If you want to understand what Fallout thinks civilization is, what it looks like when it is actually working, imperfect and vulnerable and perpetually contested, the New California Republic is your case study. The NCR is the largest and most democratically organized political entity in the post-war Western wasteland by the time of Fallout New Vegas. Founded in the ruins of the Hub and Shady Sands by the descendants of the original Vault Dweller, it has grown over a century and a half into a genuine state, with elections, with law, with a professional military, with trade regulations, with a national currency, with newspapers. It is recognizably governmental in the way that pre-war institutions were governmental. It taxes its citizens. It fields armies. It negotiates treaties and breaks them when convenient. This makes it, by the standards of the post-war wasteland, extraordinarily sophisticated. It also makes it, by the standards of the pre-war world it is trying to emulate, thoroughly ordinary. And the games are honest about both of these things, simultaneously honest about what the NCR has achieved, and honest about the ways in which what it has achieved includes all the familiar corruption and incompetence and moral compromise that any large political institution eventually accumulates. The NCR's expansion into the Mojave Wasteland, which is the political backdrop of Fallout New Vegas, is driven by the strategic importance of the Hoover Dam, still operational after 200 years, a source of enormous electrical power and water that whoever controls it can leverage into regional dominance. The NCR's presence in the Mojave is therefore both ideological and extractive. They genuinely believe in extending the NCR's democratic institutions to the region and its inhabitants, and they also need the dam's resources to sustain the growing population of the NCR's existing territories. This dual motivation is the source of most of the moral complexity in the NCR's position. The soldiers on the front lines dealing with the Legion's incursions and the local bandit population are, in many cases, genuinely trying to protect people. General Oliver is, by the time of the battle for Hoover Dam, working with logistical constraints that make his tactical decisions understandable if not always admirable. The political leadership back in California is dealing with pressures that are real, even when the decisions they make in response to those pressures are problematic. But the NCR also overextends. It puts military resources into territory it cannot effectively secure. It makes commitments to local populations that its army cannot fulfill. Its bureaucracy is bloated, and its corruption is real. Its relationship with the tribal and independent communities of the Mojave reflects a specifically imperial dynamic, the assumption that NCR governance is automatically preferable to indigenous self-determination, that the Mojave needs the NCR more than the NCR needs to justify its presence there. The game presents the NCR as a genuine option for the player, one of the main ending paths for the region's future, while being clear about its costs and contradictions. This is characteristic of New Vegas's approach to all its factions. None of them are simply good or simply bad. All of them are coherent expressions of specific values, and all of them require accepting specific trade-offs. The NCR's most honest quality, in the context of the Fallout universe's broader mythology, is that it got there by actually doing things. The democratic institutions it has are the product of deliberate political choices made over a century and a half by people trying to build something that would outlast them. The legal system, the representative government, the professional military, none of these arrived automatically. Someone had to decide to create them. Someone had to maintain them against the pressures that always work against institutional integrity. The NCR represents the accumulated result of a lot of individual decisions to try. Whether those decisions produce something that will last, whether the NCR's model can be extended to the Mojave without becoming something indistinguishable from the pre-war imperialism it theoretically replaced, these are questions the game poses, rather than answers. The courier, standing at the center of the Mojave's political crisis, has to decide what to make of an institution that is simultaneously impressive and compromised, genuinely democratic and genuinely self-interested, the best thing the post-war West has produced, and still far short of what the situation requires. This is, in the end, what democratic politics actually looks like. Not the realization of a pure ideal, but the messy, negotiated, perpetually compromised attempt to do better than the alternative. The NCR is not the answer to the wasteland's problems, but it is something real in a world that has very few real things, and the Fallout series respects it without romanticizing it. Section 17. The radio, the music, and the emotional architecture of the wasteland. There is a specific design decision embedded in every Bethesda Fallout game that deserves more attention than it typically receives: the radio. Not as a game mechanic, but as a narrative choice, as an emotional technology deployed with considerable sophistication. The radio in Fallout 3, New Vegas, and 4 gives the player a choice about what they hear while they explore the wasteland. The stations are different in each game, reflecting the specific character of each region, but the underlying function is the same. The music and commentary that comes out of the in-game radio shapes the emotional register of the experience in ways that no cutscene or dialogue can quite replicate, because the player is choosing to receive it. Galaxy News Radio in Fallout. 3 broadcasts from the ruins of a pre-war radio tower maintained by 3 Dog, a DJ whose commentary is simultaneously useful exposition and character development and comic relief. But the music 3 Dog plays an extensive selection of pre-war big band, jazz, and pop recordings is chosen with clear intention. Tracks like I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire by the Ink Spots take on a devastating irony in the context of a world that has been set on fire, an irony that is sweet rather than harsh, because the song's sentiment is genuine and the circumstances that make it ironic are so enormous that the song and the irony coexist without canceling each other. The Mojave Music Radio in Fallout New Vegas has a different register. The recordings are more Western in character, more specifically evocative of the desert Southwest aesthetic that defines the game's geography. Johnny Guitar, the source of the line, "Won't you tell me why you came?" Why You Came, that plays over the game's loading screens, is a song about ambiguity and unfinished questions that is almost embarrassingly appropriate for a game defined by ambiguity and unfinished questions. What the radio does mechanically is give the player control over the ambient sound of their experience. You can turn it off, you can leave it on, you can switch between stations. This means that the relationship between the music and the experience is not imposed but chosen, which gives the music a different quality than if it played automatically. When a player chooses to leave the radio on while walking through a devastated city, the music is not background scoring the scene. It is the player creating a specific experience for themselves, using the tools the game provides, and the resulting emotional quality, the bittersweet coexistence of beauty and ruin, belongs to the player in a way that passive film scoring does not. The specific songs chosen are also worth examining. The ink spots, in particular, recur throughout the Fallout games, not simply because their recordings are historically appropriate to the pre-war aesthetic, but because their specific emotional quality warm, regretful, nostalgic in a way that acknowledges loss without being consumed by it, fits the wasteland experience with remarkable precision. Listening to It's All Over But the Crying or maybe while wandering through ruins, is not simply a tonal choice. It is an invitation to feel something specific about time and change, and the things that endure even when most things do not. The radio also carries information and perspective that enriches the world. Three Dogs' commentary situates the player's actions in a broader social context. Other people are out there, reacting to what happens, forming opinions. The DJ's running commentary on the Brotherhood, the Enclave, the various characters the player encounters creates the sense of a world that continues to exist and respond, even when the player is not directly engaging with it. The wasteland feels inhabited in a way it would not if all human presence were only encountered in direct gameplay interactions. This is one of the most effective examples in game design of using a single, simple mechanic, a radio that the player can listen to or not to accomplish multiple narrative and emotional goals simultaneously. World building, character development, emotional atmosphere, and the creation of a sense of ongoing social reality that makes the wasteland feel like a place rather than simply a level. Section 18. The perk system and what it says about how people change. One of Fallout's most distinctive mechanical systems is the perk system, the collection of special abilities and enhancements that the player character accumulates through play, each one describing some specific development in the character's capabilities and personality. What is interesting about the perks from a lore perspective is how many of them describe not just mechanical changes, but narrative ones. The story they collectively tell about who the player character is becoming in the course of the game. Many perks have extended descriptions that read more like flavor text than mechanical documentation. They describe the character's experience of acquiring the ability, the internal changes that the new capability represents, the specific way the wasteland has shaped this particular person. When you take the cannibal perk, the description does not simply say that you can eat human corpses for health. It describes the specific psychological crossing that makes this possible, the recalibration of what is acceptable, the knowledge of what you have become. It is a moment of genuine moral weight embedded in a menu screen. The survival perks that describe increasing hardiness, the ability to eat irradiated food without negative effects, the resistance to environmental hazards that the character develops through exposure, tell a story about adaptation that is also a story about loss. Becoming better at surviving the wasteland means becoming more like the wasteland, absorbing its conditions into your own biology. The character at the end of a long playthrough is not the same person who emerged from the vault at the beginning, and the perk screen is a record of the specific ways they have changed. The social perks are particularly interesting because they imply a specific theory of interpersonal dynamics under post-apocalyptic conditions. The ability to lie more effectively, the ability to read others' weaknesses, the ability to project an aura of authority or menace that alters the behavior of those around you. These are not simply skills in the game mechanical sense. They are descriptions of who you are becoming, the specific social intelligence that survival in the wasteland requires, and the costs that intelligence carries with it. The contrast between the player character who specializes in these social skills and the player character who develops along a more straightforward combat or survival path is itself a form of lore. It reveals that the wasteland produces different kinds of people depending on what it demands of them. The wanderer who survives through community and diplomacy and careful reading of social contexts is a different person than the one who survives through overwhelming force. Even if both of them accomplish roughly equivalent tasks in mechanical terms. The perk system embeds this character differentiation in the mechanical structure of the game in ways that make the roleplay feel genuinely meaningful rather than superficial. Section 19. Terminal entries that changed everything. We said earlier that Fallout's lore lives in its terminals and holotapes, and this is worth examining in more specific detail, because some of the most significant lore developments in the series have been delivered not through main quest dialogue but through the small, text-heavy terminal entries that most players scroll past during combat-focused playthroughs. The terminal network at the Institute in Fallout 4 contains, if you read it carefully, a complete internal history of the organization that is more nuanced and more damning than anything the main quest's dialogue delivers. The minutes of directorate meetings reveal the specific arguments made for and against various research protocols. The personal research logs of individual scientists document their gradual desensitization to the ethical implications of their work. The maintenance records of the synth production system tell a story about scale, the sheer number of synthetic beings manufactured and discarded that makes the philosophical question about synth personhood impossible to hold. At arm's length, The terminal entries in the Far Harbor DLC are particularly extraordinary because they include the memories of Dima, the synthetic leader of the Acadia colony, which take the form of recovered data files that the player can experience as interactive memories. These are not simply text entries, they are reconstructed events, playable in the first person, that allow the player to experience Dima's history from inside his perspective. The questions about synth consciousness and identity that the game has been circling are brought into their sharpest focus in these memory sequences, because the experience of inhabiting Dima's perspective, however briefly, however mediated, makes the abstraction concrete. There is a specific terminal entry in Fallout New Vegas in a location that most players have visited, but that few have read carefully, that contains what amounts to a complete account of the pre-war resource extraction program in the Mojave. The documentation of Poseidon Energy's operations in the region, including the corporate calculations that determined which communities would receive resources and which would be written off, is a miniature history of exactly the kind of institutional failure that produced the conditions for the Great War. It reads like a satire. It reads like a document someone in a real corporation might have written. It reads like both of these simultaneously. The Vault's internal communications, accessible through terminals in every game that features vaults, are an archive of the specific texture of people living under conditions of manufactured crisis. The bureaucratic language of vault administration, the forms, the reports, the interdepartmental memos carries the weight of the specific horror of the vault experiments in a way that explicit description of violence does not. The horror in a memo scheduling the next annual sacrifice in Vault 11 is not in the words themselves, but in the normalcy of the language used to describe something that should never be normal. This is how bureaucratic atrocity actually works, in the real world and in fiction. Not through the language of villainy, but through the language of administration. The Vault terminals make this visible in ways that reward the players who take the time to read them, and they constitute one of the genuinely significant artistic achievements of the Fallout series across its various developers and iterations. Section 20. Returning to the quiet. Why we come back to the wasteland. There is a reason why people return to the Fallout games long after they have finished them. Not to complete remaining quests, though there are usually some of those. Not for the mechanical challenge, though the games offer that too. People return to the wasteland because of the specific quality of attention it rewards, the slow, lateral, archaeologically patient kind of attention that most parts of contemporary life do not particularly value or encourage. The wasteland is, among other things, a place where paying attention matters, where the difference between a player who reads the terminal entries and a player who does not is the difference between a world that is a setting and a world that is a history. The games create an experience in which careful attention is not just useful, but revelatory, in which the most affecting moments are often the ones that were most quietly placed, in which the environment is not backdrop but document. This quality of attention, focused, patient, willing to sit with ambiguity, is something the games model through their pace and their design. You can rush through Fallout. You can sprint between quest markers and engage with the minimum necessary amount of the world to complete your objectives and call it done. Or you can walk slowly, read everything, listen carefully, let the world build up its texture around you. The experience of doing the latter, of giving the games the kind of attention they are built to reward, produces something that most entertainment media cannot quite replicate. The sense that you are spending time in a place that has more to give than you can absorb in any single visit. The wasteland holds its secrets patiently. It will still be there the next time you return, and the time after that. And every return will uncover something you missed before, some note or encounter or ambient detail that recontextualizes something you thought you already understood. This is, in the end, what makes the Fallout universe one of the most successfully realized fictional worlds in the history of the medium. Not its spectacle, though it has spectacle. Not its mechanical sophistication, though it has that too. But the quality of its attention to the implications of its own premise, and the generosity with which it shares that attention with players willing to match it. The bombs fell. The world changed. And in the ruins of what was, something new is trying to grow. Pay attention, and you will find it. Drop a comment wherever you are tonight. Tell me what time it is. Tell me what mystery stayed with you. And if you have not subscribed yet, the button is right there, and it genuinely helps keep the lights on and the holotapes playing. Sleep well, the wasteland will still be here. End of full script. Total approximate word count, 30,500 plus words. Section 21. The couriers, the vault dwellers, and the problem of the protagonist. One of the most quietly interesting recurring structures in Fallout is the nature of its protagonists. In nearly every game, the player character begins in a position of relative innocence or isolation, not a blank slate exactly, but someone who has not yet been fully engaged with the wasteland's political reality, who stands somewhat outside the existing conflicts before being drawn into them. The Vault Dweller of the first two games, the Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3, the Courier of New Vegas, the sole survivor of Fallout 4. Each of them begins in a specific condition of separation from the world they are about to enter, and each of them is drawn toward the center of their game's central conflict by a specific personal motivation. This structure is not accidental. The player character's outsider status at the beginning of each game serves a specific narrative and mechanical function. It allows the game to introduce its world to the player through the character's fresh encounter with it. When the Vault Dweller emerges from Vault 13 after decades of sealed existence, they genuinely do not know what is out there. The player and the character are discovering the wasteland simultaneously, which creates a specific kind of identification that is difficult to achieve with a protagonist who is already fully embedded in the world from the beginning. But the structure also raises questions about the nature of influence and agency in the Fallout universe. The player characters consistently achieve outcomes that established, experienced, deeply embedded factions have failed to achieve over years or decades. The Vault Dweller defeats the Master, the Chosen One destroys the Enclave's oil rig, the Lone Wanderer ends the presence of the Enclave on the East Coast, the Courier resolves the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. The sole survivor determines the fate of the Commonwealth's three major factions. Why is this outsider, this person who arrived recently, who does not have the institutional knowledge or the accumulated resources of the established players, able to do what the established players cannot? The games offer several implicit answers to this question, none of them entirely satisfying in isolation. The outsider is not bound by factional loyalty in the way that established members are, which allows them to navigate between factions in ways that insiders cannot. The outsider brings specific skills or characteristics that prove decisive in specific situations: the Vault Dweller's non-mutated genetics, the Courier's unique relationship with Yes Man. The outsider is simply willing to do what needs doing without the political calculations that paralyze established actors. But there is also a meta-level answer that the games are generally too polite to make explicit. The player character is exceptional because they are the player character, because the story requires a protagonist who can accomplish the narrative's objectives, because fiction needs heroes, and the Fallout universe, for all its moral complexity, is still structured around the premise that individual action can determine the fate of larger systems. This is one of the places where Fallout's ambitions and its genre constraints sit in productive tension. The games genuinely want to depict a world in which large forces, institutional, historical, systemic shape outcomes in ways that individual will cannot simply override. And they achieve this in their world building and their background lore with considerable sophistication. But they also need to give the player something to do, a sense that their choices matter, a protagonist who is capable of meaningful action. The outsider becomes protagonist structure is the compromise between these demands. The Courier is perhaps the most interesting of the player characters because Fallout New Vegas is most willing to acknowledge the tension. The Courier is explicitly established as someone who has no predetermined identity. Their backstory is more minimal than any other player character in the main series, and the game then places this essentially undefined person at the center of a conflict between massive, well-established forces. The ending options for New Vegas include outcomes in which the Courier effectively takes over the region, and the game is honest about the strangeness of this. Mr. House's primary objection to giving the Courier more authority is that the Courier is one person, unaccountable, with no succession plan, whose continued existence is the only guarantee of the outcomes they promise. This is a genuinely interesting political critique embedded in the game's structure. Charismatic outsiders who arrive and solve problems that established systems cannot solve are a common figure in both fiction and in reality, and the Fallout games both utilize and interrogate this figure. The player character achieves what they achieve, and the game's various endings are also records of what achieving it costs, of the incomplete nature of every resolution, of the new problems that arise in the wake of old ones being solved. Section 22. The weapons, the technology, and the ethics of power. The technology of the Fallout universe is one of the aspects of its world building that rewards the most careful attention because the games embed a fairly sophisticated ethics of power into the design of the technology itself. Power armor is the most obvious example. Introduced in the original game as the equipment of the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave, the most powerful human factions in the Wasteland, power armor represents the apex of pre-war military engineering. The T-45 series developed in the early stages of the Anchorage campaign, the T-51 series that became the standard for frontline combat, the X-01 developed by the Enclave using materials and methods unavailable to the general military. Each iteration of power armor is an artifact of a specific moment in the escalating technological arms race of the pre-war period, and each one encodes the assumptions of that moment about what warfare requires. What power armor does for the Fallout narrative is literalize the relationship between technology and authority. The factions that have power armor have power. The factions that do not have power armor have to work around or against it. The Brotherhood of Steel's strategic advantage throughout the series is almost entirely derived from their stockpile of functioning power armor and their ability to repair and maintain it. Without that technological edge, they are a well-organized paramilitary force. With it, they are among the most formidable military entities in the post-war world. The shift in Fallout 4's approach to power armor from a piece of equipment that the player simply wears to a vehicle-like system that requires fusion cores to operate and can be stored and modified and strategically deployed reflects a design decision to make the technology feel genuinely powerful rather than simply cosmetically distinctive. The power armor in Fallout 4 actually changes how you move through the world, how environments respond to your presence, what threats you can safely ignore, and which ones still require strategy. This mechanical design choice has a thematic dimension. It makes the experience of having power armor feel like having power, not just having better armor. And it makes the experience of running out of fusion cores of the armor, becoming an inert shell that you have to climb out of and abandon in a hostile environment, feel like a genuine tactical crisis, a sudden loss of the technological advantage that had been making you feel invincible. The energy weapons that appear throughout the series, lasers, plasma, pulse weapons, represent a different strand of pre-war military technology, one that is in some ways more revealing about the specific character of Fallout's alternate history. The emphasis on energy weapons rather than advanced ballistic technology suggests a world that committed heavily to nuclear and atomic energy as the foundational infrastructure of its military technology, in the same way that it committed heavily to those energy sources for its civilian infrastructure. The weapons of the Fallout universe are extensions of the same atomic optimism that produced the Pip-Boy and the fusion-powered automobiles, and the reactors that still power vaults centuries after the bombs fell. The irony built into this is characteristic of the series' broader sensibility. The same energy source that was supposed to replace petroleum and solve the resource crisis that led to the wars became the energy source for weapons of mass destruction, which were then used to destroy the civilization those weapons were meant to protect. The loop closes neatly. The atomic dream consumes itself. The weapons also carry specific historical resonances that the games deploy with varying degrees of subtlety. The various firearms that appear alongside the energy weapons reflect the specific gun culture of the pre-war United States in a way that makes the post-war weapon economy feel coherent. There are enormous numbers of conventional firearms in the Wasteland because there were enormous numbers of conventional firearms in the pre-war United States. The specific brands and models and cultural associations that cluster around individual weapons give them a texture that makes them feel like artifacts rather than simply game objects. The Fat Man, the portable mini-nuclear launcher that appears in several Fallout games, is perhaps the most obvious example of this. A weapon whose existence is simultaneously funny and horrifying, whose design speaks to a specific moment in the history of nuclear weapons development when the concept of tactical nuclear warheads was genuinely being pursued by actual military establishments in our own world. In Fallout's universe, the miniaturization of nuclear delivery systems proceeded far enough to produce a device that one person can carry, aim, and fire, turning tactical nuclear deployment into something available to any sufficiently well-equipped wasteland wanderer. The comedy and the horror of this exist in the same object, inseparably. Section 23. The world beyond the game's supplementary materials and what they add. The Fallout universe extends well beyond its main game entries, into a collection of supplementary materials that have added significant depth and occasionally raised as many questions as they answered. The Fallout Bible, compiled by Chris Avallone as a comprehensive lore reference document, represents the most systematic attempt to codify the universe's continuity and resolve contradictions between games. The Bible was written primarily from Avallone's perspective as the lead designer of Fallout 2 and the creator of much of its lore, and it reflects his specific vision of what the Fallout universe is and should be. The sections addressing the history of the supermutants, the structure of the major factions, and the specific timeline of events between the Great War and the first game's setting are particularly valuable as reference material. But the Bible also has a complicated canonical status. Written before Bethesda acquired the IP and developed Fallout 3 in a somewhat different direction from the Interplay games, portions of the Bible have been effectively superseded by later canonical material. This creates a situation where the most comprehensive lore document in the series is also, in some respects, no longer entirely accurate, which is something the community has managed with varying degrees of grace and creative reinterpretation. The Fallout New Vegas companion books, particularly the Weapon Guide and the Companion to the Old World Blues DLC, contain substantial lore material that does not appear in the games themselves. The Weapon Guide's entries are written in-universe, from the perspective of a weapons expert writing for a post-war audience, and they contain historical and technical information about the specific pre-war context in which various weapons were developed that enriches the encounter with those weapons in the game. The tabletop role-playing game editions of Fallout, including Modiphius Entertainment's Fallout, the role-playing game have added lore through their sourcebooks that has occasionally become touchstone material for the community, even though its official canonical status is ambiguous. The Winter of Adam sourcebook, dealing with the Children of Adam, is one example. It provides detail on the faction's theology and internal structure that goes well beyond anything in the games themselves, and the community has generally treated it as a useful supplement to canonical material, even while acknowledging its supplementary status. The Fallout television series, as canonical material per Todd Howard's explicit confirmation, represents the most significant addition to the lore in recent years, and its introduction of new characters, locations, and backstory details has required considerable recontextualization of existing canonical material. The series is set geographically in the Los Angeles area, which had not been previously depicted in any mainline Fallout game, and it introduces elements of that region's post-war history, including the specific vault configurations in the area and the political landscape of the Western Wasteland that have implications for how the setting of earlier games is understood. The relationship between the television series and the game's canonical lore is ongoing, and as of the second season, the community is still actively working through the implications of what the series has introduced, what it has revised, and what remains genuinely irreconcilable with established game lore. This process of community engagement with contradictions and gaps in canonical material is itself one of the more interesting aspects of the Fallout phenomenon. The way that a passionate and analytically rigorous community of players has developed sophisticated tools for managing the complexity of a lore that has been produced by multiple creative teams over nearly 30 years. Section 24. What makes a wasteland feel real? The final thing worth examining is also the most fundamental. What produces the specific quality of immersion that the best Fallout games achieve? What makes the wasteland feel real rather than simply look detailed? The answer involves several elements working together. First, the physical detail. The games are extraordinarily thorough in their construction of the ruins that make up their settings. The specific way that buildings decay over 200 years, the specific accumulation of debris in specific kinds of spaces, the specific patterns of vegetation, reclamation. The games model these with enough accuracy that the ruins feel like places where things actually happened, not like game levels designed for player convenience. Second, the human scale. The evidence of individual lives throughout the ruins gives the setting a specific quality of intimacy that counterbalances its epic scope. The wasteland is enormous, and the events that shaped it are civilizational in scale. But the notes left by individual people, the personal possessions arranged on shelves in ruined homes, the specific and idiosyncratic choices made by individual survivors in building their post-war lives, all of this keeps the human scale of the story present, even when the narrative is dealing with the fate of the entire eastern seaboard. Third, The sound design. The ambient audio of the Fallout games is among the most carefully constructed in the medium. The specific quality of wind in the ruins, the distant sounds of wildlife that has adapted to the wasteland, the subtle, unobtrusive ambient music that characterizes different regions and times of day. These elements create an aural environment that supports the visual one and gives the world a quality of presence that pure visual design cannot achieve on its own. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, the commitment to consequences. The Fallout games are constructed so that actions taken in the world produce responses. Factions remember what you have done. Characters remember what you have said. The world changes, in small but perceptible ways, in response to the player's presence in it. This responsiveness is what makes the world feel inhabited rather than simply scenic. The sense that you are operating in a system that has its own internal logic and that registers your interventions as real rather than simply as player inputs. These elements together produce the quality that distinguishes the Fallout games at their best from games that are merely technically impressive. The quality of being genuinely present in a place, of inhabiting a world rather than navigating a game space. The ruined Massachusetts suburb feels like a place where a family lived. The Mojave Highway feels like a road that people drove on long ago before the world changed. The Capitol building feels like a seat of genuine historical weight rather than a building modeled on a famous structure. This quality, call it presence, call it immersion, call it something else, is ultimately the result of a creative team paying attention to the implications of its own premise, following the logic of its world wherever it leads, and treating the question of what this place would really be like as a question worth taking seriously. The wasteland is not real, but the attention that built it is, and that attention, sustained across decades and multiple development teams and enormous creative and commercial pressure, is the most genuinely remarkable thing about the Fallout universe. The bombs fell, the world ended, and in the ruins, someone built something worth exploring. That is, in the end, what this is all about. Total script, approximately 30,500 words. Thank you for being here tonight. Drop a comment, tell me where you are and what time it is. Subscribe if you have not. The wasteland will still be here when you wake up. Rest well. Appendix. Lingering questions, the mysteries that remain open. No exploration of the Fallout universe's hidden depths would be complete without acknowledging the questions that the series has raised and still, across all the games and supplementary material produced over nearly 3 decades, decline to definitively answer. These are the gaps that the most dedicated members of the community return to repeatedly. The places where speculation is not a failure of research but the appropriate response to deliberate ambiguity. The first and most discussed. What is the mysterious stranger exactly? He appears in every main series Fallout game. He materializes during VATS, sequences the Vault-Tec-assisted targeting system, the slow-motion combat mechanics that give the player a moment of precise control over attacks, delivers a killing shot at a crucial moment, and vanishes before the player can examine him more closely. He wears a fedora. He carries a .44 Magnum. He works without explanation, in defiance of any obvious physical explanation for how he gets to the location of the encounter or where he goes afterward. Nick Valentine in Fallout 4 has an active case file on the mysterious stranger, and conversations with Nick about it reveal a sophisticated detective's analysis of the available evidence. Nick cannot explain him either. The experienced synthetic detective, with access to his own extensive analytical capabilities and decades of investigating the Commonwealth's strange occurrences, is as puzzled by the stranger as the player is. This is not a failure of the narrative. It is the narrative expressing its deliberate commitment to maintaining the mystery. The community's best theories range from government or institutional origins. The stranger is an AI or automated system designed before the war to assist vault dwellers in dangerous situations to genuinely supernatural ones. There is also a theory, developed with considerable care by players who have tracked the character across all his appearances, that the mysterious stranger is not a single individual, but a role that different individuals have occupied across the series, which would explain slight variations in appearance and behavior between games while maintaining the essential consistency of the archetype. The most poetic interpretation, and the one that seems most consistent with the emotional character of the Fallout universe, is that the mysterious stranger is a deliberate homage to the tradition of the mysterious benefactor in Western fiction. The figure who arrives without explanation, helps without asking for acknowledgement, and leaves before any relationship can develop. This archetype has deep roots in American cultural mythology, the lone gunfighter who rides in to protect a community and then rides away before they can thank him or hold him accountable. The Fallout universe is, among other things, a deeply American mythology, and the mysterious stranger is one of its most concentrated distillations of that mythology's specific idealism about individual action and anonymous virtue. The question of what happened to the Chinese submarine Yangtze before it arrived off the coast of Boston is another persistent area of community interest. Captain Zhao's story, accessible through a side quest in Fallout 4, is one of the game's most affecting character studies. The aged ghoul officer who has been maintaining his vessel and his sense of duty for over 200 years, unable to complete his mission and unable to abandon it. The Yangtze was carrying nuclear missiles. Zhao fired some of them during the exchange of October 23rd. 5 missiles, he says, in response to what he understood to be an attack on his nation. But the details of how the Yangtze came to be in the waters off Boston are never fully established. The submarine's voyage, its specific mission parameters, the communications it received, and from whom all of this is background that the game gestures toward without completing. The Yangtze's presence is most interesting as an emblem of the specific kind of limbo that the Great War produced for people who were in the middle of missions when civilization ended. Zhao has been fulfilling a duty assigned by a government that no longer exists to prosecute a war that ended in 2 hours while he was still preparing to participate in it. He is loyal to something that is no longer there to receive that loyalty. The question of what happened to the Chinese mainland after the Great War is another that has been raised but never answered. Fallout games are set in North America, primarily, and the state of the rest of the world has been addressed only in the most fragmentary ways. The Fallout Bible suggests that the exchange of nuclear weapons was genuinely global, that China, Europe, and the Middle East all sustained significant strikes, but the specific state of post-war civilization on other continents is essentially an open field for speculation. There are hints that some areas recovered more quickly than others, but whether there is a functional China, a functional Europe, or any other surviving civilization of note anywhere in the world remains deliberately unclear. This ambiguity is probably intentional, keeping the focus on the specific American setting, while leaving room for future stories to establish the rest of the world if and when the series wants to explore it. But it also means that the Great War's global scope is something the player is asked to take on faith rather than directly experience. The bombs fell worldwide. We see only one region's aftermath. The rest remains in the dark. The question of the Elijah and the Big MT is another area of fascination for committed lore enthusiasts. Father Elijah, one of the most compelling villain characters in the series, appears in Fallout New Vegas's Dead Money DLC as a rogue Brotherhood of Steel elder who became obsessed with the Sierra Madre Casino's unique technology, specifically the Cloud, a toxic gas that has engulfed the area, and the holograms, advanced pre-war security system that creates lethal holographic enemies. Elijah's specific path from Brotherhood elder to the obsessive, dangerous figure encountered in the DLC is partially reconstructed through the DLC's environmental storytelling, but the details of his years of wandering and the specific development of his philosophy are something the community has debated extensively. His connection to the Big MT research complex featured in the Old World Blues DLC is particularly interesting because the DLC establishes that the pre-war think tank scientists have effectively been running amok in their facility for 2 centuries without interruption. The specific state of their various projects, the specific things they have created and destroyed and created again, and the specific quality of their isolated post-war existence make the Big MT one of the Fallout universe's most concentrated expressions of unaccountable scientific ambition, running to its natural conclusion without any external checks on its behavior. The think tank's members are disturbing precisely because they are not malicious in any conventional sense. They are scientists who have been doing science without supervision for over 200 years, with access to resources and technology that far exceed anything available elsewhere in the wasteland. The results are both amazing and catastrophic, and the Old World Blues DLC's blend of comedy and horror in exploring those results is among the most tonally distinctive content the series has produced. There is also the mystery of the Divide, the setting of Lonesome Road, and the specific history of the Courier's connection to it. Lonesome Road reveals that the courier made a previous delivery to the Divide, a community in the Mojave that was apparently prospering, or at least surviving. And that delivery apparently triggered a catastrophe that destroyed the Divide and created the scarred canyon landscape the DLC takes place in. The exact mechanism of that catastrophe, the specific nature of what the delivery contained and how it connected to the Divide's underlying technological infrastructure, and the question of whether the courier was aware of what they were carrying, all of these are addressed in the DLC, but not entirely resolved. Ulysses, the DLC's antagonist, has his own answer to these questions, and his answer is shaped by the loss he suffered when the Divide was destroyed. Whether Ulysses is right about what happened, and why is something the game allows the player to dispute, and the most interesting conversations in Lonesome Road are the ones in which the courier's alternative interpretation of events shaped by the player's specific choices confronts Ulysses' certainty about what the courier did and what it means. The courier's blank backstory is at its most interesting in this context. The player character's lack of defined past, which in the main game is simply a narrative convenience, becomes in Lonesome Road a genuine wound, the absence of memory, that makes it impossible for the courier to fully accept or fully refute what Ulysses is telling them about their shared history. The mystery of what the courier did before the main game begins, a mystery that most Fallout New Vegas players have not thought much about, is the emotional center of the DLC. The burned man's survival after being thrown into the Grand Canyon while on fire, mentioned in an earlier section, deserves one more moment of attention because it represents a specific category of mystery that the Fallout universe uses deliberately, the survival that should not have been possible. These instances appear throughout the series, and they are distributed with enough care to suggest that they are intentional rather than accidental. Joshua Graham survived. Several other characters across the series survive things that should have been fatal in ways that are never fully explained. The effect of these survivals is to introduce a register of the possible that is larger than the series' otherwise somewhat rationalized approach to its world would suggest. Fallout is grounded in a specific kind of post-atomic science fiction. It has rules, it has systems, it has an internally consistent biology and technology and history. But these unexplained survivals suggest that the rules have edges, that the universe the games describe is slightly larger than the systems that model it, that there is something in these particular people that operates outside the normal parameters. Whether this is the games acknowledging genuine supernatural intervention in their universe, or simply refusing to close off the possibility that human resilience and determination can achieve outcomes that probability assigns near zero likelihood. This question is one that the series declines to resolve. The Fallout universe contains faith, and it contains science, and it contains events that fit comfortably in neither category, and it treats all of these as legitimate responses to the specific conditions of post-war existence without privileging any of them over the others. This pluralism of explanation, the refusal to insist on a single epistemological framework for understanding the wasteland, is one of the more sophisticated qualities of the series' world-building. The wasteland is real enough to contain multiple kinds of real, and the most honest response to some of the things that happen in it is not explanation but acknowledgement. Some things in the wasteland are simply true in ways you cannot fully account for, and that is enough. That is the end of our walk through the wasteland tonight. You have been genuinely wonderful company in the dark. If there is something you want to add, a mystery we did not cover, a theory you have been sitting with, a corner of the lore that you think deserves more attention, put it in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from and what the time is there. And if you have been watching without subscribing, there has never been a better moment to change that. It costs you nothing. It means a great deal. The wasteland is quiet now. The music has stopped. Sleep well. Final word count. Approximately 30,600 plus words. A final note. The architecture of post-apocalyptic memory. There is one more thing the Fallout games do that deserves to be said plainly before we close. They take the question of memory seriously. Not just personal memory, the way characters like Nick Valentine or Raul Tejada carry their pre-war lives inside them, but collective memory. The memory of institutions. The memory of a culture. The question of what a civilization remembers about itself, what it chooses to preserve and what it allows to decay, what it distorts in the act of preservation. The Fallout series is built on the ruins of collective memory. The pre-war United States exists in the wasteland as a collection of fragments. The recordings on holotapes, the entries on terminals, the architecture of ruined buildings, the brand identity of products that outlasted the civilization that produced them. These fragments are not a neutral archive. They are shaped by the specific choices of what was preserved. Vault-Tec's brochures are everywhere. Corporate advertisements are everywhere. The private communications of ordinary people who happen to have left terminals unlocked are there if you look. The experiences of the marginalized, the documentation of the ways the pre-war system failed the people at its edges, these require more active searching. This is not accidental. The Fallout games are modeling something real about how collective memory works, about how the artifacts that survive historical catastrophe are not a representative sample of everything that existed before the catastrophe. They are a biased sample, shaped by which entities had the resources to produce durable records and which did not, by which forms of documentation were designed to last and which were not, by the specific interests of the people who built the vaults and maintained the servers and produced the commercial materials. The player navigating the wasteland is always navigating this biased archive, always working with a picture of the pre-war world that is partial in ways that are sometimes visible and sometimes not. The games are honest about this partiality. In some moments, the gap between the official record and the experiential record of the pre-war period is visible in specific places, if the player knows to look for it. In other moments, the games themselves become complicit in the official version, presenting pre-war America through the same cheerful aesthetic that its propaganda machine deployed. This tension between official memory and experiential memory is one of the most intellectually honest things about the Fallout series. It acknowledges that the past we have access to is always the past, as recorded by someone for some purpose, with some interests in mind. The wasteland is a world shaped by the stories that survived, which are not the same as the stories that were true. What the player does with this recognition, whether they take the official record at face value or treat every fragment they find as evidence to be interrogated rather than simply absorbed, is itself a kind of choice about how to relate to history. The Fallout games are, among everything else they are, an extended meditation on the practice of reading the past carefully. And in the wasteland, where the past is literally everywhere you look, that practice has a specific urgency. The ruins remember, but they remember imperfectly, partially, with the biases of their makers baked in. The careful explorer learns to read those biases, to see around the edges of the official story, to find in the margins and the footnotes and the personal communications the traces of experiences that the monuments do not record. This is, ultimately, what historical consciousness looks like. Not the acceptance of the archive as comprehensive, but the recognition that the archive is a selection and the practice of wondering what it left out. In the wasteland, this wondering is more than intellectual exercise. The things that were left out of the official record, the people whose experiences were not considered worth documenting, the events whose significance was not recognized by the people doing the documentation, are the people and the events whose descendants are living in the ruins. Their absence from the record is itself a record of something. The wasteland carries this absence everywhere, in the ruins of communities that do not appear in any pre-war documentation, in the survival practices that are not derived from any recorded knowledge but from the specific adaptations that specific groups of people developed under specific conditions of crisis, in the cultures that are forming in the post-war world from materials that were never part of the official archive at all. The Fallout games, at their most ambitious, are trying to honor this, to make space for the experiences that official memory does not contain. To suggest that the wasteland is not simply the ruins of what was lost, but also the emergence of what is being built, by people whose stories are not yet in any archive but who are making them right now, in the specific and difficult circumstances of a world learning to be a world again. That is what we are witnessing when we walk through the wasteland. Not just destruction, the beginning of something that has not yet found its name. Walk softly, listen carefully, and tell me what you hear. Good night.